All right, so just find a comfortable meditation posture, one that is suitable for your body, where the back is somewhat upright and straight. You can bring the eyes to just partly closed if that's comfortable for you, or you can certainly close them fully if you prefer that. And just try to relax in this posture as best as you can, while yet maintaining a sort of, again, uprightness to the body. So we're going to spend the first few minutes just focusing on the breath. And again, there are many techniques that we can use with the breath. If you have one that you already use on a regular basis, then just use that. If you need a suggestion, then you can tune into the sensation at the tip of the nose where you feel the air coming in and out as you inhale and exhale. That very subtle sensation that occurs there, just make that your meditation object and stay present with it as best as you can. So again, whatever way you're working with the breath, just maintain your awareness of the breath. And whenever you see that the mind has wandered away, there's no judgment. We just simply acknowledge that, let go of whatever distracted you, and then gently guide the mind back to the breath. So again, let's just do this in silence for a few minutes, and then I'll come in and lead you in a short reflection and setting our motivation. And now what I'd like to invite you to do is to simply look back on your own life and recall the many ways that you yourself have experienced grief. And it's not just the grief that we experience when someone very dear to us passes away, but we can also see grief as something that arises when we lose a relationship or no longer have a job or whatever goes on in our lives. The varieties of things that are losses are innumerable in our lives. Just take a moment to reflect on the way that you yourself have experienced grief due to loss. And then perhaps choose just one or two of these, perhaps those that were more impactful in your life. And think about how you learned from them already. Although today we're going to be talking about learning from grief, from the grieving process. No doubt you already learned some things through going through that grief, experiencing that emotion, healing from that experience. So just take a few minutes to reflect on what it is you've already learned from experiences of grief in your life. Again, choosing just one or two to focus on. So in this way, hopefully we've seen that there are opportunities within even this most difficult and one of the rawer forms of suffering that we have in our lives. There is still the opportunity to learn, to use it in a positive direction. And so set a motivation for being here today to continue that exploration, to continue to understand how we can use the process of grieving as a doorway to deepen our own connection to others, to deepen our own wisdom and compassion, to help us to be able to eventually help others to the greatest degree. And set that motivation for being here. In Buddhism, we always have this idea that we're here to work on ourselves so that we can then be of greater benefit to others. So in this way, we win, in a sense, accomplishing our own welfare, but we do this so that we can accomplish the welfare of others. So hold that motivation very strongly for our time together here today. So everything we do becomes a cause for that complete result, the welfare of both yourself and all sentient beings. And when you're ready, you can open your eyes fully, and we'll begin. So I do want to mention we're going to be recording this session, but I know that dealing with a topic like grief, there may be times perhaps when you want to share something that you feel is very personal and you wouldn't necessarily want it to be recorded. Please let us know and we'll pause the recording and then we'll restart it when you're finished with whatever it is that you needed to say. I want to make sure people know they have that permission, but I do want this to be interactive and people being able to share what's going on for them and explore some of these things together. I do want to mention I'm not a grief counselor. I don't have that expertise. So don't expect me to be able to provide that necessarily from a Western perspective, that type of orientation. My goal here throughout the day is mostly to look at what I've learned about grief through my own experiences, as well as things I've researched, and then also talk about how we take the teachings of the Buddha and apply them within the context of grief and grieving. So that's my aim for today. And certainly, if any of you are in a place where you're grieving actively now due to a major loss, it is good to find additional support. Certainly, at least support groups where you're with other people who are in the same situation. I found that certainly beneficial in my own experience, but also to seek out therapy, other people who can help you, who are professionals that work with grief. So I just want to make that caution before we go in. One thing I might introduce, and sometimes people have found this useful, and I might even have times during the day where we'll do this. Sometimes when we do talk about things that are a bit more emotional, it's nice to have an exercise we can do to get back into a sense of groundedness, not to stop that emotion. I'm not trying to, kind of put a lid on your emotion, but just to be able to ground ourselves. And it's what's called regulation exercise, kind of gives us a regulation of the body and therefore the mind. So what we do in doing this, I hope the people who online can see this, but you put one hand over your heart center here. Again, it's at the level of your heart, but in the center of your chest where the palm is. And you can put the other hand kind of in your lower abdomen. And then if you wish, you can close your eyes, but begin to pay attention to the sensation of the weight of your hands on your body. Just bring your awareness there and feel how heavy your hands feel. And you may or may not feel warmth under your hands, but just continue feeling the weight of your hands. And again, just breathe naturally. And no doubt at one point there will become a sort of shift in your breathing, just by paying attention to the weight of the hands. And then when you feel that shift happen, then you can just simply stay in that place for a little while. And just kind of regulating the emotions, the body, just in a deeper place. And then when you're ready, you can simply relax the hands and we'll continue. So did everyone feel a bit of a shift in the body when you did this? Again, this is an exercise you can use at any time. It's not just for this workshop, but if you do find that things are coming up for you a bit emotionally, then just simply put your hands, you have permission to do that. Just put your hands, in this place, and then just bring your awareness to the heaviness of the hands. So I was introduced to that exercise in I don't know, you probably know it from Amy Caton leading a video on for the FPMT. So anyway, so again, as the shift comes and feel that you are regulated, again, it's a nice little exercise. What I like to do with these workshops too is to have just at least a short introduction so that I know who's all here and maybe again have some idea. Oh, sorry, yeah, I moved it down. Just so I know who's here again and also have some idea of if people would like to share in terms of what brought you here today and if there are some more active forms of grieving going on, that I'm aware of that, just so that I can be attentive to that. And I don't know if we want to pause the recording for the introductions, that would be fine. And then we can have the folks who are on Zoom as well, online, do that. So do we need to pause that call, Cecilia, if you got it? Okay, good. So I wanted to go ahead and share my experience with grieving, and which I'm always happy to do. Doesn't look like it's showing it's still paused. Okay, there it is. Okay, good. My own experience with grief, I hadn't really experienced any major loss in my life until I was 34. And I did have my grandparents pass away. So certainly dealt with that. But in 1992, I lost my first partner to AIDS. He died of AIDS in August of 92. And I didn't have a spiritual path at that time. I was really kind of reliant upon what I had from Christianity, which I'd left the Roman Catholic Church when I was quite young. Just was trying to work my way through it. And of course, as everybody's already pointed out, when you lose somebody in your life or any particular loss in life, you're dealing with that reality of not having that anymore. And the day-to-day sort of habituation around having someone in your life or having a job or having a relationship, whatever, all these various things that we have to deal with going out of our lives. The stark reality of facing that can be very, very painful. And I think it does require some sort of spiritual context for us to be able to work with that. Fortunately, Sogyal Rinpoche, who some of you may have heard of, he wrote a wonderful book called The Tibetan Book of Living and Dying. And it was published in 1992, the same year that Ed passed away. And so essentially I was exposed to this book that seemed like the perfect thing for me to read, because here I am confronting the issue of mortality, of Ed's passing, of my own mortality, which this was very much putting up in front of me, you know. And so I started reading Sogyal Rinpoche's Tibetan Book of Living and Dying, and ended up going on retreat with him the next year. And this became my whole, the rest of my life to this point. If I had not had that experience, I don't know how quickly I would have found the Tibetan Buddhist path. But what struck me from Sogyal Rinpoche's book in particular, it's a wonderful book, still amazing to this day, 30 years ago. So I want to share a little story that was in the third chapter of this. You may have heard this story, some of you, but I'm going to do like a little story time reading to you from this. It's a story that really kind of resonated with me at the time. And he says that when he was a child in Tibet, he heard the story of Krisha Gotami, a young woman who had the good fortune to live at the time of the Buddha. When her firstborn child was about a year old, it fell ill and died. Grief-stricken and clutching its little body, Krisha Gotami roamed the streets, begging anyone she met for a medicine that could restore her child to life. Some ignored her, some laughed at her, some thought she was mad, but finally she met a wise man who told her that the only person in the world who could perform the miracle she was looking for was the Buddha. So she went to the Buddha, laid the body of her child at his feet, and told him her story. The Buddha listened with infinite compassion. Then he said gently, "There's only one way to heal your affliction. Go down to the city and bring me back a mustard seed from any house in which there has never been a death." I've heard some stories talk about how the Buddha was saying he could make a medicine, but the medicine required a special ingredient, a mustard seed from a house where death has never touched that house, right? Krisha Gotami felt elated and set off at once for the city. She stopped at the first house that she saw and said, "I have been told by the Buddha to fetch a mustard seed from a house that has never known death." "Many people have died in this house," she was told. She went on to the next house. "There have been countless deaths in our family," they said. And so to a third and a fourth house until she had been all around the city and realized the Buddha's condition could not be fulfilled. She took the body of her child to the charnel ground and said goodbye to him for the last time, and then returned to the Buddha. "Did you bring the mustard seed?" he said. "No," she said. "I am beginning to understand the lesson you are trying to teach me. Grief made me blind, and I thought that only I had suffered at the hands of death." "Why have you come back?" asked the Buddha. "To ask you to teach me the truth," she replied, "of what death is, what might lie behind and beyond death, and what in me, if anything, will not die." The Buddha began to teach her. "If you want to know the truth of life and death, you must reflect continually on this. There is only one law in the universe that never changes, that all things change, and that all things are impermanent. The death of your child has helped you to see now that the realm we are in, samsara, is an ocean of unbearable suffering. There is one way and one way only out of samsara's ceaseless round of birth and death, which is the path to liberation. Because pain has made you ready to learn and your heart is opening to the truth, I will show it to you." Krisha Gotami knelt at his feet and followed the Buddha for the rest of her life. Near the end of it, it is said, she attained enlightenment. Now, again, I'm not expecting people to, necessarily subscribe to a Buddhist path on the basis of that story alone, those of you who are new to Buddhism. But nonetheless, I think it's important that we recognize that there may be some truths within Buddhism that can help us in our own experience with grief and loss, can be a doorway through which we can see some of what the Buddha taught. Certainly, we do see this reality of impermanence that is a part of what we have to face when we have loss in our lives, that things do change. Of course, the Buddha says that most of us deal with a misconception, thinking that somehow we can rely upon things in an unchanging way. Going back to the pandemic and what started, a couple of years ago when we had to face the reality of that, that was the most painful thing for people, right? Because we all thought there was some certainty we could rely upon every day being kind of like the previous one, that we could get up and go to work and do all the things we do, go out with friends, whatever, all the various things that we have in our lives. And that was taken away from us like that, right? And we all had to deal with that reality. Well, we were all living with some misconception, right? Remember so many people saying, I don't like the uncertainty. And I'm like, the uncertainty was always there.
Yeah.
You just didn't know it was there, you know? And that's what's kind of scary for people, right? Because we do like that. You know, we cling to that idea, things being somewhat fixed and unchanging. It's kind of interesting. I try to read another book on grief every time before I teach this. And the one I read before this one is a little different. It's called The Grieving Brain. And it's actually a neuro scientist who's writing on, her name is Mary Frances O'Connor, writing on the topic of grief and the brain and why it's so hard to let go of people in our lives and to have that transition away is because the brain actually gets wired to have this constancy of a presence in our life. The very beginning, she compares it to, if you imagine that it's kind of nighttime and you didn't turn on the lights to go downstairs, and where your dining room table is, you think you're going to bump into it, but it's not there at all. You know, the brain gets wired to have a certain sort of map, not just physically of our lives, but emotionally of what we have in our lives. And that map of our lives, when we remove something from it, we have to deal with that voidness, that emptiness that is there, of no longer having that in our lives. And the brain takes a while to adjust to that. So we even have a physiological component to grief. We're going to get into this a little bit today as well. It's not just that we're dealing with the mental patterns, which is what Buddhism specializes in that. The Buddha's expertise was the mind. And by mind, we mean that sort of psychological landscape, everything that we deal with that is not, physical. That's an important part, obviously, of what we're talking about today, but recognize that grief is also embodied within us and the hardwiring of our own brains. So hardwiring, I don't like to use that word now because certainly there's no real hardwiring. Everything can change over time. Neuroplasticity, most of you have heard this concept. So we have the ability to change our brains, but it does take some conscious effort on the part of our minds to induce that effort. So another little story that I want to share that I'm going to put the slides up in just a moment here. I can get this to come up. There we go. The book's written by Mary Frances. It's hyphenated, Mary Frances O'Connor. Yeah, you can come up and take a look at it during the break. I'll have that here, and if you want to take it and have a little look at it, you're more than welcome to do that. So let's do a little slideshow here. Okay. So, oh wow, it's working differently than today. This is great.
Yeah.
All right. So, by the way, these are the topics. I can't seem to get it to kind of move that little box over there. I think what I'll do is I'll just do this. Yeah, that's the easiest. These are all of the topics that I'm going to deal with today. And right now I'm still at the very first topic, right? Opening thoughts. Can everybody see? Okay, yeah. Feel free to adjust your chairs, get where it's comfortable for you to be able to see the screen. And I'm hoping everybody at home is seeing the screen fine. I would think so. Then we're going to go on to talk about the nature of grief, which of course has many different dimensions to it, but I'll try to summarize that to some degree. The necessity of grief. Again, I don't want to keep jumping ahead of myself with all these things. These topics are all important. The process of grieving, which again is not something that's cast in stone. It's something that we have different aspects to it, but it's important to talk about that so we have some comfort with what all comes up as we go through a grieving process. And then, of course, using grief on the path is the main one. Oops. That's where we're going to focus on Buddhist teachings and how we can use what we're experiencing to augment our Buddhist teachings, and then we'll have concluding thoughts. Yeah, Stephen.
What's the definition?
We'll get into that. Yeah. I'll give you like the classic Western definition, and then we'll give some kind of more evocative ways of looking at it. So, whoops. So what I wanted to share was a little story about the poet Issa. You may have heard of Issa. There's Issa, Busan, and Basho, who are like the three main haiku poets of Japan. There are others that are included sometimes, but Issa apparently had a really tragic incident in his life where his one-year-old daughter died of smallpox. And this is from what he wrote that's called A Year of My Life, and it includes a haiku at the end. But he says here, it is a commonplace of life that the greatest pleasure issues ultimately in the greatest grief. He had this wonderful daughter being born, and then a year later, her passing away. Yet why is it that this child of mine, who has not tasted half the pleasures that the world has to offer, who ought by rights to be as fresh and green as the vigorous young needles of the everlasting pine, why must she lie here on her deathbed, swollen with blisters, caught in the loathsome clutches of the vile god of smallpox? Being as I am her father, I can scarcely bear to watch her withering away a little more each day, like some pure untainted blossom that is ravished by the sudden onslaught of mud and rain. She grew weaker and weaker, and finally, on the 21st day of June, as the morning glories were just closing their flowers, she closed her eyes forever. Her mother embraced the cold body and cried bitterly. For myself, I knew well it was no use to cry, that water once flown past the bridge does not return, and blossoms that are scattered are gone beyond recall. Yet try as I would, I could not, simply could not cut the binding cord of human love. And this is the haiku that he wrote on the basis of these feelings of recognizing the reality of impermanence that he knew so well, but yet the conflict with the feeling of loss that he was experiencing and not wanting to accept that to some degree. The world of dew is the world of dew. And yet, this poem just really strikes me sometimes because we can have that, we can understand it's a world of dew. Everything's going to evaporate, going to change, going to, move on. This is a world of transition that we're involved in. We can get that reality even through Buddhist teachings, which emphasizes this is one of the first teachings the Buddha gave. And he even taught it on his deathbed. As he passed away, he said, remember, everything is impermanent. Work out your liberation for yourself. These were his last words that he gave to beings. But even though we hear it and we kind of get it intellectually, and yet, I don't want to let go of that. I don't want to feel that loss. And again, the variety of losses here, we've been mostly working with losses of people in lives, but obviously there are many forms of grief, many forms of loss. So again, this is what we're going to be working with today. This idea of we have to have some grounding in Buddhist teachings to help us, but nonetheless, we have to respect what grief also is showing us. Buddhism, as we did in the talk the other night on the environment ecology and how, Buddhist response to it isn't just to simply say, oh, well, we're going to transcend this world or something. We're looking to achieve some state of liberation. It's not so important to pay attention to this world. This world is what we have. This world is beautiful and precious, and we need to be attentive to it. And so too are our relationships and all the things that we do have in our lives. Buddhism doesn't deny those things have value. There's quality to all of those. Just sometimes our minds get distorted in how we relate to those things. Obviously, that's part of our problem. But nonetheless, grief gives us valuable lessons. And I do want to mention this idea of learning. I found it interesting towards the very end of this book. Mary Frances O'Connor introduces the idea of learning. She says psychologists have defined learning as, quote, the process by which changes in behavior arise as a result of experiences interacting with the world. So we have these experiences interacting with the world, going through things. We can learn from them. We can have changes in our behavior on the basis of that. And I think Buddhism is very much subscribing to this concept of learning. So I use this title for today, Learning from Grief. So that's what we mean by the learning, is how do we be open to that experience showing us something that will affect our behavior, affect how we look at things, how we work with things in our life. Let's go on to talk about grief and the nature of grief. So this is the classical sort of definition. I got this online from thefreedictionary.com. It's my go-to place when I'm doing things and want to check, the actual definition of a word or what have you. Grief is deep mental anguish as that arising from bereavement or an instance of this. Now, I don't like this definition all that much because I think it's too narrow. It really
Don,
doesn't fit into.
sorry for interrupting. We're only seeing slide 1, so maybe just if you don't share, then we can see you.
How do we fix that? Because I'm not sure how to fix that because it's sharing it here on the screen and it's on the share screen on the thing.
I have no idea. So you are,
If I go back to this, then probably you'll be, are
Yeah.
you seeing the other one now, Cecilia?
Yes, now I see.
So I wonder,
Yes, now I have
wonder if I
the,
have to go off and go back in for every slide. I don't know.
That's a nice thing. We should be able to scroll from here.
Yeah,
just try it real quick. Try it with, let's see if they can catch up.
see, now it's not scrolling from here. Here we go again. Oh, maybe down here. Can you see that? Can you see a new slide, Cecilia, with that?
no, I have, no.
You have this still the definition of grief. Okay.
Hmm,
And we just, well, yeah, you just switched it, right? We saw two. We see this slide, I don't know what number it is.
that green button at the top, can you share?
Now we have another.
Yeah,
Okay.
Okay.
Okay. So
that did
maybe it's
work.
good. Okay.
Yeah, so now you are sharing. That's good.
Okay.
Okay.
Okay, so something happened that didn't allow it before. So anyway, I won't go back to that one, just to keep it where it is. But that definition of grief, again, I don't find very satisfactory because it doesn't explain, in a sense, all the other things that we could lump into that category of grief or grieving. Now, I will say that Mary Frances O'Connor in her book, she delineates a difference between grief and grieving. Grief being those sorts of moments that we have where there's an arisal of an emotive response to something, and grieving being a process. And I think that's okay. I mean, I'm going to kind of lump them together to some degree when I talk about things today, because it's too maybe burdensome to say grieving versus grief. We're going to call it all grief and, the process of grieving. But nonetheless, know that there are those sorts of moments that we feel that are very strongly identifiable as grief. That we can say, oh, there's a moment of grief. There's something that's happening. But oftentimes when we're dealing, especially with the loss of someone very dear to us, there's a process that goes on as well that we can call grieving. Again, let's go to this next description that comes from the book that I mentioned, that Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, she wrote a book on death and dying, and I'll talk about her 5 stages of those who approach their own mortality and confronting that reality, and then also those who they can be adapted to grief and grieving. This book they wrote on grief and grieving, she wrote with David Kessler, says grief is an emotional, spiritual, and psychological journey to healing. I like this a little bit better, right? It's a bit more spacious, and it shows that there are many elements of it. It's got an emotional component, obviously, because we're dealing with that strong emotion that arises when we have the sadness of losing someone or losing something in our lives. There's a spiritual dimension, as we're going to talk about today. And this is really the key, environment that we want to be exploring today. And there's a psychological component in terms of being able to investigate, what's going on with our own thought processes and mind, not just the emotions, but, what thoughts we can introduce. I might include in there, as I said earlier, physical. It's also a physical process of healing. I know when I went through my loss of Ed, I had the good fortune of having a very dear friend, Irene Smith, who was in my life at the time. She passed away about 1.5 years ago. Had to deal with her loss during the pandemic. Couldn't make it out there to see her in San Francisco and spend time with others caring for her. She passed away from cancer. But she was renowned for having brought bodywork into the field of working with people with HIV. In 1982, she went to San Francisco General to provide bodywork to patients who weren't being even touched by doctors. Doctors wanted nothing to do with them. They had all the masks on and everything because nobody knew what HIV was and where it was coming from. And so she would go in there as a volunteer and provide just very intentional touch, skillful touch to these men, generally men. Anyway, Irene was a good friend. I was even on her board for a while of her organization and was a volunteer for her, doing massage body work myself with people who were in hospice situations. But she invited me over to have body work after Ed passed away. She said, would you like some touch? And I said, that would be really wonderful. And I can't tell you what that initial experience of just like sitting on a table with grief in my body as well as my mind. And just the release that happened just in that one session of being with her. And then I was seeing regularly a massage therapist. So know that although we aren't going to talk, that much about the body, because the body isn't, again, maybe Buddhist's main concern, but nonetheless, know that you are holding grief in your body even. And we have to be attentive to that and find ways to release some of that. And, so I think this is a much better definition and gives us this idea of it's a journey to healing. And again, I don't think there's some place where we get to where we feel fully healed. As we talked about earlier, you still have that grief that you carry with you, that loss that you carry with you. I just went through the 30th anniversary of Ed's passing in August, and I can't say it was as intense, certainly, as the first anniversary. That first year is much more challenging when you lose someone in your life. But nonetheless, there's still that feeling of loss that we do carry with us. So it's a journey. These are, again, a little bit more descriptive. Jack Kornfield, many of you know Jack Kornfield or heard of him. He's a wonderful Buddhist teacher in the Insight Meditation Society tradition, Vipassana tradition. Grief is one of the heart's natural responses to loss. When we grieve, we allow ourselves to feel the truth of our pain, the measure of betrayal or tragedy in our life. By our willingness to mourn, we slowly acknowledge, integrate, and accept the truth of our losses. I like this one even more. It's nice. The previous one was nice, but this gets to kind of an integration of everything and really understanding that this is natural. I do feel like in Buddhism, in my experience, Jack Kornfield's one teacher, but maybe Tibetan Buddhism more specifically, I don't think that we talk about grief enough. I don't think that we deal with grief enough. And I almost feel like there's a sort of judgment that goes on sometimes around grief, that we're not supposed to have these feelings because we're supposed to be like Isa and get that, oh, yeah, I understand it. The world of do is the world of do. But we have that and yet, why am I confronted with this pain? Why do I have to deal with this difficulty? So I think that, again, we have to see that it's completely natural to grieve. Now, one thing I found really interesting about this book, The Grieving Brain, I'm going to end up kind of talking about that probably a lot more because I hadn't read it prior to some of the other times I've taught on this subject, is that she says there are certainly some things we could call from a sort of therapeutic point of view, complicated grief where things aren't necessarily getting to a place where there's an integration of that and a sort of moving on and what have you. I even saw it in San Francisco. Certainly had other friends who lost their partners to AIDS, who could never heal from that, who could never kind of move on to being back involved in society, doing things again, experiencing joy and what have you. I hope that at some point they were able to do that. I lost track of them over time, but nonetheless, I think this is, there are situations that we could call complicated grief, where the journey of healing and the integration of all of that, accepting the truth of our losses, doesn't happen completely. And certainly be attentive to that in your own life or with others that you might know who are grieving, and seek out proper, counseling and people who can help you with that. Because there are certainly ways to do that, but we will talk about that a bit more when we get into the whole process of grieving. And then this is a nice little one that I don't know much about this person at all, Jamie Anderson, because she's I think it's a she, author. I don't know, but I love this quote. I did my little research on quotes about grief, and this one came up. Grief, I've learned, is really just love. It's all the love you want to give, but cannot. All the unspent love gathers up in the corners of your eyes, the lump in your throat, and in that hollow part of your chest. Grief is love with no place to go. It gets more poetic. We've kind of gone from the very hard, technical definitions to something that becomes much more poetic. And when we say love, again, that might think, well, then this is really only about grief where we are loving people or animals, people, beings in our lives. But it's also, we do have a love for what we do have that are other things, a love for our job, a love for, other things we have to let go of. So I think we can make this pretty broad, even though it's using the word love. But there is this connotation that the love that we have, it doesn't have its object any longer, right? At that moment, it can't in the present moment. This is the most painful thing I felt when I first went through Ed's loss. It was like the person who I loved was no longer there, that object of my love. The love is still there, and that's what we carry forward, obviously, is the love that we have for those beings. But the object of our love is gone. This one is nice from Rabbi Earl Grolman. He says, grief is love not wanting to let go. And that's sort of tension that's going on there, right? We have that love, but that love doesn't have the object, but we don't want to let go of it. But you don't have to let go. That's one of the things that I think I've learned in my own grieving process, but also that we're going to talk about today, is that love is the genuine part of it that we carry forward with us. Maybe some of the other more painful emotions and things will fall away and we can, process through all of that. But we have to let go physically, but we don't have to let go of them in our hearts. Absolutely. So So any comments or questions on, let me take it off. Should I take it off screen? Should I dare to?
No, you can call.
You know, what's weird is like, I have to hit escape, I think, to do it. I'm not seeing what you've got on the screen up there. I'm not seeing, I don't know.
I'd like to make a comment. I think.
Yes,
with,
please, Karen.
A loss and I lost a loved one, just to a breakup.
Mhm.
And I think for years, I thought that if I didn't keep on grieving, that I'd forget.
Mm,
And there's part of me that like didn't want to forget those memories.
yeah.
So I would stay in the grief,
Mhm.
you know.
Yeah.
But I really understand that.
Yeah.
Grief is
Yeah.
love, not wanting to let go.
Yeah. So what Carly's bringing up of like grieving so that we don't forget the person and forget that experience, we can still remember, we can still carry that forward. And the memories are there and are something that kind of, I like at the end of this book, she talks about grief sort of in the three times, the past, the present, and the future. And grief of the past, it does mean we can still go to those places of the memory that we have of that time, that person, whatever it was that we're letting go. And that's honoring that and saying that was an important part of who I am and how I see myself. But we have to also work with it in the present and recognize that we have this moment here now that we also have to be attentive to. And Buddhism is all about, right, the present moment and being kind of attentive to that. But then we also, of course, have the future because we have to eventually work with, well, where do we go from here? How do we use what we've learned? And that's what, I'm not trying to toot my own horn or anything, but that's what I felt was really the gift of my own grief, was that I was able to make a spiritual path out of it. And moreover, you know, a whole profession of what I do now. That before this, Stephen was asking me, what was I doing before I became a Buddhist teacher? I was working in finance for Levi Strauss and Company in San Francisco, you know, very, very different
Can't
job.
do that.
I would never want to go back to it. So dry now, it seems, you know, in comparison. So, you know, there I had that opportunity. But I'm not saying everybody's it's going to look identical for everyone either. I think this is the one thing we have to get out of is that there's no mold for what grief looks like and for what the process of grief looks like. We're going to talk about that later, but nonetheless, you know, we all have our own way of integrating that into our own lives. And we have to, again, use the tools that we have to be attentive to that. One thing I want to talk about in terms of while we're still on the nature of grief is to get to this idea of the griefs that we experience almost continually to some degree. There's this wonderful little book that I also was very appreciative when this came out. Guy Newland, who many of you have heard of, he's a wonderful Buddhist scholar. I think he lives up in Michigan. And he's written like on all these very deep philosophical subjects. And he lost his wife to cancer some years back. I'm guessing it's about 10 years ago now, maybe. He wrote this book a couple of years after she passed away. And there was the wonderful book by C.S. Lewis called A Grief Observed, which was more from a Christian point of view because C.S. Lewis was Christian. This is called A Buddhist Grief Observed. And it's just a nice little book. And I found it's really refreshing to read. And it starts off, of course, with this whole concept of, well, people were asking him, you know, as a Buddhist teacher, did the Buddhist teachings help you in your grief? And he goes into that, and we'll talk about that when we get to that subject. But the one thing that he did talk about is this whole idea of micro griefs. He says, grief is the process of adjusting to unwanted change. And since change is unrelenting, we bear every day unrecognized micro griefs. I mean, so we've been talking about grief at a very gross level when we have the loss of someone in our lives, but we also have even what are subtler, but still fairly gross when we lose a job or a relationship of, you know, what have you. But then we have even micro griefs. Every moment kind of that going away. And that, I mean, sometimes I have that feeling sometimes at a day where I think, well, what did I really get done today? I lost a day or something, you know, and there's just a little moment of grief. It's nothing that you can really, I don't know, get too excited about, but it's there all the time. That's because everything's changing all the time. Yeah, Stephen.
Also, just coming across in your daily operation, will remind you of your real grief.
Yeah.
In fact, somebody sees someone and something that reminds you of that.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that would be definitely a part of the landscape of grief and what happens. I'll tell you one story with Ed. Ed was very cute. He would like bring home 50-cent pieces to me sometimes. I don't know. This was the thing he did, and I had a little piggy bank I would put the 50-cent pieces into. You can't even see these coins anymore. Right? I think they took them out of circulation. But it was weird. About, I don't know what duration of time, I don't remember. That whole grieving period is very strange in terms of isolating individual moments. But I went into a store one day and the clerk gave me a 50-cent piece back with the change. And I just sat there and just started weeping, because it was like, took me back to that place. And I swear, I have not gotten a 50-cent piece since then. That was the only time it happened. But just that one experience of receiving that was like enough to just trigger this whole wellspring of tears and just loss and what have you. But we can have that with regard to anything. It sort of triggers it for us. Even hearing another person's experience of loss sometimes takes us back to that place. So this is the idea that we're going to be, again, working with the idea of grief, not just being those larger moments, but even down to micro griefs, even down to what we have to deal with of everything constantly letting go. On Sunday, tomorrow, I'm going to talk about conscious aging, which is its own process of grief, right? Of aging and watching us continue to let go of, oh, that's gone. My youth is gone. This part of my youth is gone. This part of even my old age is gone, or whatever, as we continue moving along. Now, the causes of grief. Now, again, Mary Frances O'Connor in this book shares, of course, what's going on that are the physiological causes, that are going on with the brain and all. I'm not going to talk about that. It's a wonderful book to read to give you that perspective. It's very different, though she's very sensitive to the sort of psychological side of it as well. She's not somebody who's purely scientific. So there is a nice dimension to the book from that. So I'm not going to talk about that side of it, though, as I said, it's quite interesting when you examine what's going on with our brain and how we map out various things in our life and rely upon those being there. And when something is absent from that, be it again a job or a person or whatever, well, then we are disoriented. We're like fumbling around and trying to fit that absence into our new view of who we are and of what we are, and what our lives are. But I want to talk about a little bit from the perspective, maybe I should take it off of this because I'm going to talk for a little bit, talk about the idea of, I hope that worked. Screen sharing has stopped as the window is closed. Okay. So what I might have to do, I think what I might have to
What happened?
I guess we lost. Nicole was telling me this morning, she's like, I cannot believe this internet. We're paying so much monthly. We'll see. And she's not answering her phone. So
Okay.
uh,
I'll read the slide over. I took a screenshot, so I'll just read the slide. Yeah.
let me see.
Yeah, Penny, we're frozen too. I don't know if you.
A little bit symbolic.
Sorry about that, everyone. So you'll need to spotlight me again, Cecilia, I think, so that other folks aren't on screen for the recording. Is that done?
Things might take a second.
Yeah. Yeah, because Cecilia's doing them remotely. So
I think you are still spotted. Oh,
you
no.
think so? No, yeah,
Now,
there
you
we
are.
go.
Now you are.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay. All right. So let's talk a little bit about from a Buddhist perspective where I realize do you guys normally take a break for 2 hours? No.
No.
If anyone needs to stand up at any time or go to the restroom, please go ahead. I mean, I'm sorry you'll miss a little bit of my talking, but hopefully you pick up the thread when you come back in. I just don't want people to feel like you have to sit in this space for all that time. And if you're on Zoom and you want to just, not share your camera and just exercise, do whatever you need to do to get circulation going, that's perfectly fine. So from a Buddhist perspective, we already talked about how grief is love not having any place to go, kind of that love, that we see as the main sort of component of it. We have to isolate love out from what we call a more diluted state of mind, which in Buddhism, we use the term attachment. Now, I don't want to use this as an equal term for what we call attachment in kind of Western therapy, because the attachment theory about what happens with the child being raised and the attachment to the parents and what have you, this is a healthy thing, right? That there has to be some sort of mirroring and connection between the child and its parents for there to be healthy development. If that attachment doesn't happen due to complications, then there can be issues psychologically for children, right? So I'm not talking about attachment as equivalent to that. I'm talking about attachment as a distorted state of mind. When attachment is operative, we'll compare it to love. Love is very much an emotion that is looking at the other person or the object of one's love and being mostly concerned about them. So when we talk about love for another, it's the love that causes us to think, I want that person to be happy. I want that person to have happiness in their life. And we operate from that place. And even romantic relationships have that to some degree, right? Because we are concerned about that person. We wouldn't stay with them if we didn't have some concern for them, though I guess you can have narcissistic tendencies that cause you to be solely isolated on your own welfare and what have you. But usually this is a healthy part of love, and it's the main part of love where we are actually concerned about the well-being of the other person. Attachment is the exact opposite. Attachment is distorted because it's looking at things from the point of view of what can you do for me? And we have both of those involved in our relationships. We often are concerned about the other person, but then we get upset if the other person isn't showing equal concern for us, right? Well, what about my needs? What about what I want? Again, I'm not putting a right or wrong on this. I think we just have to recognize that these are both involved in our grief. No doubt every one of us still has both of these. I mean, if you're some being who's done a lot of deeper work, then perhaps you've addressed your attachment and you've been able to be free from it. But most of us still have a lot of attachment. And so when we lose someone in our lives who's been playing that very key role of taking care of us as well as we've been taking care of them, well, then obviously there's much more pain involved. And there are different levels of it that we will go through. At times we'll feel sad for ourselves, for us not having what we want in our lives. At other times we'll feel sad for the other person that they're no longer there, that we don't have that object of our love. So it gets a little complicated. I don't want to make it very, too complicated, but we do have both of these, operative. And obviously there are many other dimensions to why we experience grief, the sort of causes of grief. But this is a main dimension, is the way that we're actually framing things and looking at things. We need things in our lives, often from that mind of attachment. We need them to be supplying us with what we want, with what we get that gives us some sort of nourishment emotionally, psychologically. So recognize that will be a part of it. And there are tools to work with attachment. Buddha taught many tools to work with attachment, to recognize that that's not such a healthy state of mind. So our attachment, and then when it was interesting, when I was reading this section on complicated grief, I could see where a lot of complicated grief can come about because the attachment is too strong. Right? Because we are too much concerned about, I need to get that from that person, and that person's no longer there. So then we are in this frustrated mode of like seeking something that we can't possibly ever get from that person because they're no longer in our lives. So attachment is a mind that will be more complicated for us to heal from. Whereas the love is genuine and is definitely a part of the pain of grief. Without a doubt, we experience grief because we've loved others. I remember reading in one book, I don't remember which one it was, that if you don't want to grieve, well, then don't love. That's not a way to live your life, right? Who wants to live a life never loving others, never getting connected to others or to other things in your life? Again, I'm talking about grosser forms of grief there. Perhaps you still, even if you don't love, perhaps you have to deal with other forms of grief. But who wants that? We want to have that richness to our lives. Love is an important quality for us all to have. In Buddhism, we even often call it loving kindness, so we can differentiate it from the love that gets a bit contaminated with our attachment. But know that both of those are certainly a part of why we experience grief. And she talks in the book, again, The Grieving Brain, about the physiological components there. But I think there's also something that just happens physiologically by virtue of us being connected to others. Joan Halifax Roshi, she wrote a wonderful book called Being with Dying. And she says, as mammals, we form complex bonds with one another. And when these bonds are broken, our very bodies grieve. And that is something, again, to recognize. There is always that physiological component too, that we feel like something's been ripped out of us. There's that hole again in our heart or something. Physiologically, it feels like we're missing something because we've gotten used to the proximity of various things in our life. Again, whatever it is that we're grieving. So know that there's that physiological component as well that, again, I'm not going to dwell on so much, but be attentive to that and recognize that some of the healing also needs to come about through working with our own bodies. I'm sure some of you in the room who might do therapeutic work and whatever have recognized, how we hold things in our bodies, and you can see it in clients that you work with. I know that in that period of time, it was really important that I be attentive to that when I was actively grieving or in a more, intense form of grief. Any comments on that? I know it's not really a lot on the causes of grief, but it gives you a little bit of context, perhaps. Anything? I'm going to try. Yeah, please, Rob.
I often recognize that there's legitimate suffering and illegitimate suffering. And
Yeah.
Typically illegitimate suffering, which I experience the most, is self-induced, is due to this illusion disillusion, right? This attachment that I created that's false.
Right.
It's
Right.
spiritual
Yeah.
ignorance.
Yeah, in the talk tomorrow, I'm going to talk about this idea that the Buddha taught of the 2 arrows, which you probably have heard. That's from the Arrow Sutra, Salata Sutra, I think it's called. He essentially says that we have the first arrow, which we always are going to have to deal with, right? As long as we're in this samsara, this cycle of existence going from life to life. That's what we're talking about today to some degree, is the loss we experience. And tomorrow we're going to talk about it in the context of aging, and dealing with these bodies that continue to move in this progression towards death. But we have a second arrow that we create entirely from our own side. And that's all the mental anguish and all the stuff we put on ourselves on the basis of the first arrow. The first arrow happens and we can just accept, oh, that's a moment of suffering. That's some difficulty. And then we have the second arrow that is our whole story about it and all the overlay about it and how awful it is. And I'm not saying, again, that in the process of grief, some of that is necessary. I'm not saying that it's something that you want to completely get rid of, but at the same time, recognize it for what it is. And a lot of it is self-inflicted. By the way, one thing I want to say before we go too far on this workshop too is know that this whole concept of learning from grief and the whole way that we're approaching grief today as an opportunity for us to really deepen our own spirituality and connection to others and what have you, that this isn't something you want to tell somebody who's freshly grieving. Somebody, they just lost their husband or wife or dog or whatever, and you go, oh, this is an amazing opportunity for you. That's not what you say to somebody who is grieving at that stage. If you're working, know them, and later down the road, you might be able to introduce things that help them to gain a different perspective on it, to actually use it as grist for the mill. But we as Buddhist practitioners here, or those who are interested in Buddhism who are gathered here today, want to be able to see that dimension to it and want to work from our own vantage point. And that's fine. That's where you can kind of see it as permissible. But if you're working with people, again, newly grieving, probably not the best thing. Let's talk a little bit about actually, I had one more slide. Let's see how this works. What I think I have to do is when I hit this, I think I have to do the screen or the, there we go. This tab is just really weird. It does. So I have the feeling that even though, get that slide. Oh, this is that problem I have too of not getting the menu to
So
disappear.
if you click on a black space in the menu, you can drag it and move it.
Really?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, so you can move it down. Yeah.
Oh, and then I can hit the slideshow. Oh, it's already on slideshow. How did it get on slideshow? Now let me try that. Now what I have, so Cecilia, I guess you're seeing the one that says the causes of grief. right?
Yes, that it's highlighted or on bold, right?
Okay. And then if I hit that, you probably don't see the next slide, right? Do you see the next slide? A quote?
Yeah, you see love and grief.
Okay, great. Okay, it did work. Okay, so let's, this is a quote that just is back on this whole idea again of love being one of the main causes of grief. You see, love and grief are two sides of the same precious coin. One does not and cannot exist without the other. They are the yin and yang of our lives. Grief is predicated on our capacity to give and receive love. As I said earlier, if you don't want to grieve, well, then don't love. But I don't like that alternative. It's just not a good way to live one's life. So let's go on to talk about the necessity of grief. And this is something I really want to emphasize because, again, I don't feel we're given permission to grieve enough, not just in Buddhism, as I said, with, Tibetan Buddhism and more specifically, but in our culture. I didn't grow up at a time, my parents talked about their lives, and what it was like for them. Oftentimes people would die at home and there'd be a gathering at the home that would all be about expressing the grief there within the context of the body being right there and, having just died and what have you. There'd be just a very different approach to things. Nowadays everything is so like, oh, we want to have that out of view and we want to make sure that we kind of package everything really well. And people go to memorials and they're afraid to cry at memorials, afraid to show emotions. People will even apologize when they share emotions. I find this really kind of, interesting and it's understandable, right? Because we are in a society that's almost embarrassed to see and to express emotions. But we need to be able to be in touch with all of that, right? Be able to express that. Yeah, nothing.
So so my father recently lost his only sister, and she's kind of was basically his first child. And he's a physician and he's unable to he was unable to watch her die. It was just he was there every single day in the hospital, but when he knew that the time was coming, he had to go. And it was the same with my cousin, my father's niece, where he couldn't be with her when he was sick. So how?
When you say couldn't, you mean that they didn't want to be there? Or
he did not.
right.
He just.
It wasn't that something else came up. It was that
No.
they said
She
made
was
a conscious
asking for
choice
him
to
and
not be there.
he wasn't
Interesting.
there.
Yeah.
And I was upset with him for that, but it wasn't until I saw him with my aunt that I realized, okay, you can't be there. But with somebody that won't even acknowledge their grief, how can you help them? Or can you even help? I know we can't really help anybody once they're not sick.
Well, and I think what you're bringing up, Fatima, is the truth that, there is no sort of formula for how we grieve, and people are going to grieve differently. And there are those people who don't feel that that's their mode of grieving, is to publicly or to even privately sometimes, be in that space of grieving. And we can't really do much to change that, unfortunately. I mean, but as much as our heart will break to see them not attending to their emotions, nonetheless, they're on their own process. Now, again, there's nothing wrong, I suppose, with it suggesting perhaps that they might explore some things that, but people also have those issues too, right? Like if you said to somebody, oh, well, maybe it'd be useful to go to a support group, to be with other people who've lost a sibling or who've lost a, whatever, a pet. There are different support groups for different people in different grieving, situations. But some people are kind of not even there. They don't want to be with other people, even with that kind of a space where they have that permission. So I don't know that there's much that we can do. Maybe others in the room can speak to their own experiences and found what might be useful. I think one of the problems is it's very private. It is something we have to respect that privacy of and acknowledge that everyone is going to do it in their own way or not do it in their own way, as the case may be. Yeah, Stephen.
Would grief fall on the spectrum of emotional intelligence?
I think it's probably some way of relating it to it, certainly. I mean, we could say those people, again, may have lower quotients in terms of not being able to go to that place of the emotional experience of grief. And again, it's just saying they have different ways. And they do talk about these sorts of stories in that book, for example, The Grieving Brain, where she has different people that come in and they work out their grief through mowing the lawn or something like that. They have different ways of approaching it, and just the busyness that people often have after grief indicates that that's how they want to channel that energy, how they want to work with it. it's not to say that that's the healthiest way necessarily. And there are people who, again, have complicated grief because they've never allowed themselves to have those experiences of really just being in touch with that raw emotion. But again, this is where it more gets into the field of people who are more professionals and have the expertise of working with those who are in grief, as opposed to the Buddhist perspective on it, which says, again, that we're all going to have that experience to some degree. You know, how we work with it, how we process it is going to be our own individual path. So I encourage, you know, in terms of this idea of the necessity, I encourage people to work with it, to actually say, I have to find a way to work this, even if it's in the privacy of my own room, you know, and whatever, and I'm going to actually experience that. Yeah, Rob.
I was sorry to interrupt.
That's all right. Yeah.
Just continue.
Fatima.
To your experience, I know that I've had difficulty in my life being present in some of the most profound celebrations of human life, right? In my family, my most immediate family, where she count the most, where I haven't shown up. I've said I can't or I haven't been able to, for whatever reason. And what it goes to in looking at that is my inability. It's because the experience of being there would be more painful for me, right? It's a very selfish act. It's been extremely painful, or I really wasn't taught how to be present for others in those situations. When I've observed it in others, I've recognized that they're suffering, and because of the teachings that I've experienced here, I've learned to be extraordinarily compassionate to those who, rather, you were saying that you get a little upset with your dad for using to do that, or there's something he's experienced that's really painful, or you know, it's prevent who's generally, I'm sure your father's generally a very compassionate man, very loving, giving, and caring for his patients. In fact, that might piss you off sometimes. It seems like he's caring more for his patients than he is for his family, right? But that's what I experienced. My sister's a physician. I've seen that happen. So I'm just saying that there's something going on for him that deserves his your compassion.
Oh, and just one point before we go to Jack, if you can hold on to your thought, Jack, is that okay? Yeah. What Ralph was saying, I mean, this is once more, I want to try to at times interject, how do we be with others in their grief? And just being present with their grief is usually what's called for. We don't have to fix it. I think this is the other thing that goes on in society, is that people are too intent upon fixing it. And I get that the motivation is often sometimes good. It's the compassion we feel for that person who's grieving, and we don't want to see them in their grief because it's painful to see them in pain. But sometimes being with that pain is what has to happen. So we have to have the willingness and the ability to be present. And I think Buddhism teaches a lot of skills for being present, right? For being able to be with somebody and sit with them quietly and hear their grief and, you know, be with them in their tears. I think it is an important thing that we offer to others in their grief. Yeah, John, thank you for sharing that one.
Yeah, when my father passed away,
Mhm.
I think 10 years ago, I think.
Mhm.
My mother was like, you know, on the subject of necessity, she was like, "Oh, I'm fine. See, you know, my friends have no problem at all." She almost passed away. I mean, they've been married, I think, 50 years.
Mhm.
She almost passed away too herself.
Right,
And
right.
she never admitted it to that, but she started having physical problems,
Right,
stomach
right.
problems, and
Mhm.
you know, and it was all
Caught up in
she
the grief.
just didn't
Mhm.
breathe after it now so long.
Right.
I just got diagnosed with diabetes. He's a physician, he knows how to eat well, he knows how to take care of himself. It's like, the physical is so real.
Yeah.
And I'm a light worker, I do it, like I do great theater, and sound healing, I do just that sound bowls, and I tried for him, but he was just so resistant.
Mm-hmm.
Let any of it go.
Yeah. I mean, I certainly have no expertise in a lot of these areas, but they do often say that, again, physically, if we don't process the grief, it can manifest in illness and dis-ease. I like this, when we actually look at what that word disease is, it's not being at ease. It's not having a state of ease. So this often happens, what Jack's saying too, like people even passing away shortly after their partner passes away, their lifetime partner, because they don't, the pain of it is just really difficult to process, and perhaps they don't even feel up to the task, and so it becomes sort of manifest within them. Yeah, I don't know. These are the interesting dimensions of grief and kind of how we can see again the importance of actually being attentive to it. And if we have that perspective as we're trying to develop today, of this is also something we can say, I certainly wouldn't welcome it into my life just, as, oh, take a choice. So yeah, I'd like to have some grief. Thank you very much. But if it's come into our lives, then we can say, well, then what can I learn from you? Buddhism often has that perspective of, we look at everything that happens to us as grist for the mill. Everything is being an opportunity for us to be able to say, I don't know why we still have that on there, but I hope they're seeing me at home. I don't know. But everything is an opportunity to learn. In fact, Pema Chodron, I'll give one quote from her later, wonderful teacher of Tibetan Buddhism. She uses this as a description of what karma is. I'll talk about karma a little bit later. But karma is, in her perspective, life giving you the lessons you need to learn. Because if everything that we experience is a product of our past actions, as what karma essentially is pointing to, everything that we've done in the past ripens into what we experience in the present. Everything we're doing now is ripening into our future experiences. Everything is the product of karma. Well, then everything has a lesson within it in terms of showing you kind of where it came from, if you have the wisdom and the insight to be able to see it from that vantage point. So grief is also a karmic occurrence. Now, again, karma is not the teaching I would throw at somebody who's just newly grieving either, right? Say, well, this is your karma, can you learn from it? Well, that's not very compassionate, right?
It's your own damn fault.
Exactly.
It's your own
When we hear teachings on karma, everybody does take it that way of like, oh, tell me, I think this is even Pema Chodron said in one of her teachings, tell me again why it's not my fault, because that's how we hear it. It's fault and blame. Karma is not fault and blame. It's an explanation. It's not a justification. It's an explanation of why things happen. Just like if I were to explain to you how to grow corn, okay, you take the corn, you put it in the ground, you till the soil before, you do all these, and you tend to it and everything, and you'll get corn. Well, that's just an explanation. It doesn't put any value on whether it's good to have corn or not. It's just an explanation of why things happen. So karma is not the teaching. And when I get to sharing later the Buddhist teachings that might be useful to incorporate into our grief, Guy Newland in his book says, the teachings on karma, not so helpful, especially when you're in that beginning stage of working with grief. It doesn't really help. And even if you apply them to the person, he said with his wife, it made no sense to kind of think in terms of this was her karmic thing, karmic seeds ripening into her illness and having to contend with the pain of cancer and death and what have you. It doesn't provide any real relief to the person who's grieving to look at their loved one in that light. Again, I think we have to be very careful about what teachings we apply where in Buddhism, and not just think that everything is an antidote for whatever's going on. There are oftentimes very specific things that we can, focus on, and other things we just leave to the side. So, a few other things on this whole idea of the necessity of grief. A wonderful little line from the poet Rumi, the great Sufi poet. The healing of the pain is in the pain. And this is one of the things we always have to respect about grief as well. Yes, it's painful. And I think this might be some of what your father's dealing with. Is he doesn't want to go to the place of the pain, perhaps, but he doesn't recognize that the healing of the pain is in the pain. You have to go through. We often use this idea, right? There's no way around it. You can't bypass this and get to the other side of having been through your grief without going through the grief. You actually have to take that straight path and experience the pain of loss. And it's so difficult. I know those of you who have gone through it or are going through it currently, that this is really a very difficult place to be. Yeah, Jeff.
But I don't remember where it says, if you're going through hell, keep going.
Keep going. Yeah.
If you're going through hell.
You're going through hell.
Keep going.
And that is something that actually,
Sounds like
something so simple, that really did help me. It was a very
It's
difficult time.
true.
But just reminding myself of that. You gotta keep going.
Yeah, I have another quote later that I'll share. I find this interesting when I teach on this subject. It seems like everything starts floating around, like everything I'm going to talk about. It's hard to isolate it as this, then this, then this, because it's all interconnected. So anyway.
Hey, can I share?
Yes.
something?
Oh, yes, please. I'm sorry. Let me take it back off of sharing. Please,
That's
Marcy.
all right. You can, okay.
By the way,
Uh,
remember, if at any time you want to share something that you don't want recorded, please do let us know. But go ahead, Marcy.
Just not as funny as what the other guy just said, but in relation to what you said, that is what happened to me personally. I lost my daughter, in a car accident. And then when I was going through therapy last year, everything was inside and I didn't realize that I had like built up all these walls around. So it's just what you said, like you have to go through the pain. When I started seeing the therapist, and she would ask me questions and have me talk about things, and it was so deep that I hadn't been thinking about it or letting it out, but she pulled it out, slowly over the sessions. And she used to say that all the time: the only way to go through it, you have to go through it. But once you get to that deep pain and work on it, understand it, feel it, it is better when you're through the other side. So I totally agree with that.
Wow. Yeah. Thank you for sharing that. And again, I empathize. It's not a pleasant place to be in that, pain of grief, but that's the way we actually get to the other side. Yeah. There's no other way through. I want to share just a few quotes. Was there something else in the Kampa you wanted to share, or anything else from those
So
on?
Don, I thought of Queen Elizabeth with
Mhm.
Jack's,
Mhm.
talking about his mother, because I can remember that picture of her
Mhm.
sitting in the church
Mhm.
all by herself when her husband died,
Mhm.
and he died, what, about 16 months ago?
Oh, damn, not
And
that
she
long.
was just curled into a ball, and I guess it just wasn't proper for her to express grief.
Yeah, yeah.
And I think that's kind of what hastened her death in many ways, because he was
Very
such
well.
a part of her.
Yeah, very well could be. I know that I didn't read the article. I saw it come up on CNN online today or yesterday about the Queen's passing, and like the grieving process, that it's almost like a regiment that they go through around grieving when a royal dies, and it's very
Yeah.
bizarre. Like there's no freedom to grieve the way you want to grieve.
That's
I mean,
right.
if Prince Harry wanted to scream at the top of his lungs in the middle of this, ceremony or something, there'd be no way for him to do that, right? I don't know. It's interesting. We don't
It's
have
all ruled by the institution.
yeah. And there should be the freedom to grieve the way we need to grieve. And that's, again, have some respect from the side of those who are watching those grieving, but also if we can help in that process, I think it is good, to not just recognize it. We do have a society that doesn't really allow for that to happen so easily. So I think it is good we're going to try this again, see how this works.
And also, I
Yeah.
just want to say, Cecilia and you guys on Zoom, would it be helpful for us to pass around a microphone so you could hear us in the audience better? I know I'm pretty loud, but maybe not
We
the
can
others.
hear, I think we're good.
Okay.
Okay.
And
All
can
right,
you
good.
see?
No.
No, we don't have the camera hooked up to see people,
They can see you.
unfortunately. They can see me.
Yeah. That's all that matters.
Let me just share a few slides here. This is from Steve Leder. I read this book a while ago. Really nice. He's a rabbi in Southern California. Can't remember the name of his synagogue there. It's from a book called The Beauty of What Remains. He wrote after his father passed away. He said, "We lose so much love to death. And if that love was real and deep, the grief is real and deep. Grief is not a race to be won or an illness to be cured. To deny grief its due is to deny love." So again, this says it right in black and white, very simple. This is what grief is about, is just simply acknowledging that we have to go through this. It's nothing to be cured. There are people who specialize in working with grief, but they're never about kind of completely removing it. That doesn't take that experience away. It's helping you to get to a place where you're more kind of stable and can work with integrating things into life after that loss. So it's really, again, just a process. Let me share, this is from David Kessler. He wrote an interesting book that I'll talk about when we get to these stages this afternoon. He says there's a 6th stage after the 5 stages that Elizabeth Kubler-Ross identified, which is finding meaning. And this is very similar to the quote from Winston Churchill, right? One night I happened to come upon a documentary called Facing the Storm about the buffaloes in Montana. Robert Thompson of the Montana Department of Fish, Wildlife and Parks discussed how buffaloes run into the storm. So if there's a storm coming, they run into it, thus minimizing how long they'll be in it. They're really quite intelligent, I guess, understanding that, if the storm's coming that way, well, then I'm going to run into it rather than running away from it, because then I'll just be in a longer storm. So he says they don't ignore it, run from it, or just hope it will go away, which is what we often do when we want to avoid our storms of emotion. We don't realize that by doing this, we're maximizing our time in the pain. You're just going to spend more time if you just keep not attending to it, not processing it. The avoidance of grief will only prolong the pain of grief. Better to turn toward it and allow it to run its natural course, knowing that the pain will eventually pass, that one of these days we will find the love on the other side of the pain. I think the love is throughout it. I don't want to say it's just the love on the other side. There's a kind of a different love on the other side. We're going to talk about that as well. Like a lot of things I keep saying I'm going to talk about. Building up my list. But the relationship does change. On the other side of loss, there still is a relationship. There still is love. And throughout the process, the love is there, but it will be very different on the other side. Now, the necessity of grief can also be seen in terms of other dimensions, in terms of what it does. If we want to talk about the gifts that are there within grief, that again are not the best way to frame it at the beginning, but we can see that over time. One of the gifts is that it makes us stronger as we deal with our own vulnerability and mortality. And I'm going to share a little quote here from a poet and author, David White. He says, the only choice we have as we mature is how we inhabit our vulnerability, how we become larger and more courageous and more compassionate through our intimacy with disappearance. And this is very similar to what I mentioned earlier about David Kessler, that quote I'll share later about we become bigger. Our grief doesn't necessarily get smaller. We just become bigger. We grow from it. Well, you have to be in a place of vulnerability to be able to develop that strength, right? And one story I'll share about Ed as well. I don't like to, again, to be talk too much about myself, but perhaps some of these stories are useful. Ed had dementia towards the end of his life. He had AIDS dementia. It wasn't really that pronounced, but it was difficult at times working with him. But I had to help him out with a lot of things. But one day while I was helping him kind of get in and out of bed, he looked up at me and he said, "Wow, I didn't know you were so strong." And of course, you know, the surface stuff says, well, you know, I'm just lifting him out of bed and I'm really not that strong. I mean, look at me, I'm like a 98-pound weakling at times. I'm not like this physically strong person. I've never lifted weights or any of that sort of stuff, right? But there was like a hidden meaning in there, because what I heard him telling me was the other dimensions of strength, you know, how strong I can be to be there with him and to help him through this process. Because there were times where he would be conscious of what was going on. He knew he was moving on towards death and what have you. So when I heard that, you know, and didn't realize I was so strong, it was telling me I didn't realize I was so strong either. But that's a place of vulnerability that we have to come from to see that strength. I know Brene Brown, many of you have read some of her books. She really has worked with this idea that we don't really develop that courage and that conviction, and that is so much a part of our character that really builds us into amazing beings, without being in those scary places, without being vulnerable. We don't like our vulnerability. That may be, again, what's going on for your father, perhaps, is that's a vulnerable place for him to be. And he's always the one serving others, being in that position of power and what have you. And so I think what we're blind to is that vulnerability is also a doorway to greater courage and strength. And maybe that's something that would be useful. You know, Brene Brown's book, Daring Greatly, deals with this whole concept of, you know, we grow the greatest when we are able to be in that vulnerable space. I think another thing that shows the necessity of grief in terms of how it can help us, it really enriches our gratitude for what we have in our lives. Yes, we're missing that person or missing that job or missing that relationship, but we can be grateful for what it did provide us. This is a doorway through seeing how we are benefited by so many things in our lives. Can be grateful that even that micro grief happens. Oh, well, we had that. How wonderful that we had that. Yeah, we don't have it anymore, but how wonderful that we did. I mean, even looking at the pandemic, that whole thing I brought up earlier about how we were almost collectively grieving in the midst of the transition from pre-COVID to COVID. Well, we can be grateful we had all those wonderful years without a pandemic. I mean, my gosh, it was 1918 was the last great pandemic in this world. Let's hope it's many more years before there's anything as serious as this, or more serious than this. But, you know, we tend to lose that perspective, right? but grief can be a doorway through exploring that gratitude. It also allows us to know love and share love with others. It can help us to connect to other suffering as well. This is something we're going to go into more this afternoon as well. But our grief can be a doorway to connect with others. I know that when I was in my active period of grieving, it's particularly within that first year, I found that the people who I tended to rely upon as friends in my life weren't so accessible. And even when I was with them, it wasn't quite what I wanted or needed. You know, why? Because I don't think they were understanding where I was at. They didn't have that experience of grief themselves, especially the grief of losing a loved one. Well, then it's very hard for people to identify with that and know what's the proper thing to do. I even feel bad. I wrote a letter to some of my friends who were back in Chicago. And I said, you know, I really don't feel like I'm getting the support from you that I need this time. And I just kind of laid it out for them, and I never heard anything from them at that time. I've reconnected with them. And I feel bad that I kind of laid that on them. But you know,
need to laugh, it's kind of funny.
yeah, but you know, I don't think that if I would not have been a great support to others had I not gone through grief myself. To you know, those people that I work with who are grieving more actively now as well. So I think we have to almost have that experience to some degree. Not that it's identical, you know, because it's never identical. One person's loss and their grief is never going to look like another person's completely. But we at least have that ability to connect with others, the empathy with others. Were you going to say something,
You
Brian?
just mentioned 1918, being a
Uh-huh.
pandemic, my grandma lost her two-year-old twin boys in that.
Oh my gosh, wow.
And you
Yeah.
think it would have killed most people.
Right, to lose them.
She was the most loving, most spiritual, and most generous person I've ever known.
Right. She really grew from that.
She
You know,
grew from it.
She's very relative.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes.
yeah. Yeah, I mean, you know, again, the choice is really ours to some degree, though I can't say it's just a pure choice. Obviously, we're affected by a variety of other factors. No doubt there were other things that influenced your grandmother to be as loving and giving after this amazing loss, this horrific loss.
Yes.
You know, but when we hear some of these stories, I remember that was what was breaking my heart most at the beginning of the pandemic, was like whole families that were decimated and maybe like one or two people left behind that had to kind of rebuild their lives after losing everybody practically. I mean, how to recover from that type of loss? And there wasn't hardly any support at that time. There weren't memorials and active ways of, you know, grieving and what have you. It's really sad. And I don't think our country's healed from that at all. Most people probably have not gone through the full process of that because we haven't had an opportunity. We're still in that kind of mode of contending with this pandemic. You know, it still kind of lingers on and maybe lingering on for quite some time. Another thing that we can see is that, as we're going to get into this afternoon with talking about this process of grieving, is that it can help us to find deeper meaning in life. You know, I think this was, again, what I found in my grief process was that I really needed a spiritual path. I needed something to give context to this. This is why when I saw the Tibetan Book of Living and Dying, I was like, that's the perfect thing for me to read right now. Because I just needed to make sense of what death was. It's kind of like Krisha Gotami, you know, what is death? Well, what of me if anything goes on? By the way, the Buddhist answer to that is consciousness. You know, the thread that connects us from all of our lifetimes is consciousness. And it's our consciousness and what we do with our minds. I'm equating mind and consciousness here. What we do with our minds that actually goes forward with us as well. Everything that we do that is, you know, progressing our minds, everything we do that is degressing our minds, all of it is carried forward with us. So this is the spiritual path I embarked on, you know, after losing Ed. And I think, again, that can be a dimension to opening to our process of grieving as well. I want to share even what His Holiness shares on this topic. Many of you have read the Book of Joy, wonderful book that he wrote with Archbishop Desmond Tutu, who of course passed away not too long ago either. Pretty amazing being. So this is His Holiness talking about the process of grieving. He says, the way through the sadness and grief that comes from great loss is to use it as motivation and to generate a deeper sense of purpose. When my teacher passed away, I used to think that now I have an even more responsibility to fulfill his wishes. So my sadness translated into more enthusiasm, more determination. I have told those who had lost their dear friend or family member, It is very sad, but this sadness should translate into more determination to fulfill their wishes. If the one you have lost could see you, and you are determined and full of hope, they would be happy then. With the great sadness of the loss, one can live an even more meaningful life. Again, that's the deepest sort of necessity of grief, if you will, is if we can see that grief is actually this amazing doorway through which we can find greater purpose and greater meaning and live that out in the rest of our lives. Again, I'm not saying it's going to look the same for everybody. Not everybody has to become a Buddhist teacher like I did. Not everybody has to, feel what His Holiness was feeling about his teacher and being even more dedicated to the Buddhist teachings because he lost his teacher. But we have to look at it from whatever perspective. Well, what does this mean? And we've seen these amazing stories in our world, right? Where somebody loses a child to gun violence and then they become dedicated to doing whatever they can to end gun violence. That becomes their purpose, their meaning. Well, how inspiring, right? Instead of just sitting at home with the lights turned out and, crying with a candle on or something. I mean, they have to do that. That's not saying that that's not a part of the process, but that's not all of what the whole picture of grief is. The necessity of grief as a doorway to find that meaning. Yeah, Fatima.
It reminds me of a quote from Rumi, and he said, if your heart breaks, let it break open.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
so the light comes through.
Yeah, that's a wonderful one. If the heart breaks, let it break open. Yeah, this phrase of the light, that's where the light gets in. There's another quote that's like that. There's a crack in everything. That's where the light gets in. We all have those cracks, we all have those things, but yeah, when it breaks open, absolutely. So these are the things that, again, I've talked about today: the nature of grief, the causes of grief, the necessity of grief. Well, this afternoon, what we'll do is we'll go into more of the process of grief and talk a little bit about how it's talked about more clinically, if you will, though again, that's not cast in stone either, but some of the dimensions of what the grieving process looks like. So we have some comfort with that, and also even begin to look at, well, what do those different dimensions of the process of grief have to teach us? What can we learn from them? And then go into a bit more detail about how we work with Buddhist teachings in more specific ways around grieving. Any comments or questions from anybody? Again, those in the Zoom room, if you have anything you'd like to share, anyone? No? Yes, please, Carly.
So, I've had friends that were sick and my dog that was sick and a family member that was sick. And I pushed away because I didn't want, kind of going back to your dad. I didn't want to see them that way. I thought by not seeing them, it would be easier. Really, it wasn't. So I understand what you were talking about earlier. Sometimes you think that you can get around it, but you can't.
Yeah, this whole concept of kind of bypassing, it's a dangerous place to be because we don't know what we're bypassing and the strength of that we're bypassing by trying to get around it. And again, as we've already pointed out, sometimes these things can even manifest physically within us and disease in the body because we haven't addressed them. They're there under the surface. So I think it's a really dangerous thing. There's even a term that was coined by John Wellwood, who's a Buddhist psychologist, called spiritual bypassing, where oftentimes we come to these amazing teachings, and even some of what we'll get into today, we might look at it and go, oh, that's where I want to go. It's kind of this more advanced level. I know when I even came to Tibetan Buddhism, because I'd done a lot of work around HIV in San Francisco, I was a volunteer at the AIDS Foundation on the hotline, and then I became a volunteer delivering meals to people with AIDS, and then I became a hospice volunteer, and all these things. You really like this, you feel a charge from doing things for other people. But that's the more advanced level of the path, and you can't just say, well, I'm just going to jump right to that without really looking at my own stuff, my own garbage. So it's all part of the path. We all have to kind of start where we are and recognize that bypassing doesn't work. If you don't go through in that more methodical way, you're potentially losing and missing out on something that's really important, and it will come back in some manifestation. So I don't know. These are tricky things, but as much as we need it, I know it's painful to be open to others' loss and to our own loss in our lives, but we have to be able to be there, to kind of let the heart break open and encourage that so that we can eventually develop the light and develop the ability to help others. The one thing I certainly find, as I was mentioning earlier, that when you've been through the grieving process yourself to a great degree with like losing someone very dear to you, you're much more qualified on the other side to help others who are grieving in some way. I mean, I'm not saying I'm some sort of grief expert, but it does give you that shared experience. Just like people who you wouldn't go to a, look for like a cancer support group that had no one with cancer in it, right? It would be ridiculous, right? Because they're not going through what you're going through. So we need people who have that, who can then empathize. And the only way we're going to get to a place of being able to empathize with others is through experiencing our own pain and our own suffering. I love the analogy in Buddhism that they often use for this concept of the lotus. If you've seen lotuses growing, they grow in like the muckiest part of the water. It's like muddy and really disgusting. And then the stem comes up and the flower, blossoms unsullied by the mud. But you need the mud. That wonderful book by Thich Nhat Hanh. I was jealous when he came out with this because I never would have thought of this myself. No mud, no lotus.
Yeah, yeah.
And that's life is like that. You don't get to the beautiful lotus. You don't get to this beautiful place without the mud, without the garbage, without the suffering. When we talk about these Buddhist teachings this afternoon, I mean, that's where the Buddha started. He started talking about suffering and the unsatisfactory state of our existence. But that's the stuff from which we transform. It's not like we have this sort of battle with all of that, and that's the enemy. It's that we recognize that it's by our very nature of suffering and the fact that we suffer that we can then transform, that we can then use all of that as, again, grist for the mill, as what we need in our spiritual path. So Buddhism is all about totality, integrating everything, embracing everything, whether it be climate change that we were talking about the other night, or all the various things going on in our world, or whether it be individual losses, what have you. It's all part of our path. So, all right, let's just have a few thoughts of kind of dedicating. Hopefully everyone will rejoin us in an hour when we resume. But just have some nice thoughts saying whatever's transpired over this last 2 hours, whatever thoughts you've had, words you said, all of these are seeds. We want those seeds to grow into the greatest possible result. So we're going to think just for this past 2 hours, whatever seeds we planted, may they ripen into our own complete enlightenment, the fulfillment of our own potential, so we can help others to do the same. Okay, good. So we're going to have an hour lunch break. And again, if you do. So welcome to this afternoon's continuation of Learning from Grief. And what I'd like to do is to do a short meditation that's taken from a book by Joan Halifax Roshi. I mentioned her earlier, wrote a book called Being with Dying. And there's one chapter in there that deals with grief. And it's actually on the book list. I put together a little book list that I'll have for everybody, that you can know some of the books I've referred to if you'd like to look at any of those. But I'm going to do a short meditation on encountering grief. It's kind of based on what we often refer to as kind of the metta or loving kindness meditations that we sometimes do, where we have these sort of thoughts, these affirmative thoughts that we do around ourselves and of course around others. So we're just going to spend a couple minutes, as we did before, just focusing on the breath. So find a good meditation posture, one where the body is upright and alert, but also somewhat comfortable. Again, keep in mind that with having just eaten food, perhaps our bodies are wanting to shut down and go to bed or something, take our siesta. So we have to maybe keep the eyelids a little more open, keep some light coming in, keep the body very upright and straight. But as I said, try to relax into this posture as well. And then, as before, just work with the breath in whatever way you find suitable for your mind right now. Oftentimes, if we are a little sleepy, then it's good to work with that point at the tip of the nose. It keeps our awareness in the upper part of the body. So we can just kind of be aware of the breath, paying attention to the breath. And when the mind wanders away from the breath, simply guide it back. So we'll do this in silence for just a few minutes before I lead you in this meditation. As you continue to just breathe naturally, I'm going to recite a few phrases and have you think about each of these phrases. And you might actually do some sort of gesture of caring and concern for yourself. Some people just simply place their hand at their heart, similar to what we did with that regulating exercise. Just you can use this sort of touching your heart gently as we recite these as a way of helping to cultivate them even more deeply. I'll just go through each of these and give you a little time to reflect on them. May I be open to the pain of grief. May I find the inner resources to be present for my sorrow. May I accept my sadness, knowing that I am not my sadness. May I accept my anger, fear, anxiety, and sorrow, knowing that I am none of these. May I accept my grief, knowing that I am not my grief, and also that my grief does not make me bad or wrong for having it. May I be open with myself and others about my experience of suffering and loss. May I find peace and strength that I may use my resources to help others. And may I and all those who grieve be released from their sorrow. And then when you're ready, you can open your eyes fully and we'll continue. Welcome, Graciela. Good to see you. So again, in the morning, we took a look at the nature of grief, at what causes grief. We can look at some of the Buddhist ideas of what goes on in our minds that causes grief, and then also the necessity of grief, in particular that we do have to go through grief, that it is an important experience, can have many benefits to it, as I mentioned this morning, helping us to enlarge our own heart, to connect with the suffering of others, to help us to have gratitude for all the things that we do have in our lives that we have to let go of at times due to the nature of things, everything being impermanent. So what we're going to move on to for the rest of today is to take a look at, again, the process of grieving. Again, I'm not an expert in this by any means, but I think there is a way of kind of working with the concept of what all can happen in the grieving process. It's maybe not even quite as linear as what happens in the process of dealing with one's own death, but nonetheless, what has been pointed out to by Elizabeth Kubler-Ross as being the 5 stages of dying are also the 5 stages of grieving. So we'll go into that in more detail. And then talk about, again, the main point of this workshop today, to really how do we use the experience of grief as an opportunity to enhance our understanding of the path. So for this, I may have to give some additional teachings on various elements of the path, but I'm happy to do that. So what I'd like to do to introduce all of this is to talk a little bit about these 5 stages. First of all, are there any comments or questions after lunch of anyone, anything you needed to ask or share in terms of? Okay. All right. So I'm going to share on the screen. Hopefully this will all work again. Keep our fingers crossed. Okay, so hopefully, I actually forgot to share this quote this morning. Hopefully you're seeing that on the screen at home. Without suffering and death, human life cannot be complete. This is from Viktor Frankl, who was a neurologist, but he's renowned as the author of Man's Search for Meaning, which is a book he wrote after his experience of being in the concentration camps in Nazi Germany. He found it's really an interesting book to read, but if the essence of it is that those people who were in the concentration camps, whether they survived or not, their outlook on life had a great bearing on their suffering. If they continued to hold some sort of purpose and meaning behind what was going on, they were able to stay in a much more positive vein in spite of what was going on around them, the horrific situation it must have been for people to go through that in Nazi Germany. So, and not just Germany, obviously, all the other places Germany occupied and what have you, but it's a book well worth reading. But his whole contention is that we grow through our suffering, that suffering is actually a dimension that we can utilize as a way of advancing our own psychological, emotional, spiritual development. So very much in line with what we're talking about today. So the process of grieving. So I said we're going to kind of primarily rely upon this idea of these 5 stages. This is from the actual book on grief and grieving, and I want to introduce it with a few slides, and then I'll take it off the screen and we'll talk a little bit more about these 5 stages. This is from the book on grief and grieving that I quoted from earlier. The stages, these 5 stages, have evolved since their introduction, and they have been very misunderstood over the past 3 decades. They were never meant to help tuck messy emotions into neat packages. So don't think that with this presentation that this is about some sort of little blocks of time or blocks of things that we can put everything in. Grief is a messy process, much messier perhaps even than accepting one's own mortality. The original book that was written on death and dying was primarily her observations as a researcher with people who had been given a certain prognosis. When you're told that you have stage 4 cancer or whatever, you might have some 6 months to live or a year to live. There's a process that one goes through of accepting the reality of that death. If you go through all the stages, acceptance is the final stage, as we'll talk about in a moment. But essentially, this is in regard to grief, you can apply these same concepts of these 5 stages, but it's not that linear. We're going to get into that with some of what they say here. But just keep in mind that it's not meant to package everything up kind of neat and tidy with a bow on top or what have you. They are responses. The 5 stages are responses to loss that many people have, but there's not a typical response to loss, as there is no typical loss. Our grief is as individual as our lives. I've already mentioned this earlier today. I think it's important to keep that in mind. Some people feel like, they've never had a loss and they think they're grieving wrong or whatever. And there's no wrong or right, as I was saying earlier, in regard to your father, in regard to various people who experience loss. It's an individual process. Nonetheless, there can be complications from it if people don't attend to that experience and going through the pain. So the 5 stages, they're listed here for you: denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance, are a part of the framework that makes up our learning to live with the one we lost. They are tools to help us frame and identify what we are feeling. And that's how we should be looking at them. It's just, it helps to be able to correlate and to say, oh, I'm experiencing depression. That's natural. It's a part of the stages of dealing with loss, grief. Not to, again, really do much more than that, but obviously to give us a context for validating our emotions and making sure that we are attentive to them then.
That one
But-
phrase there is so interesting.
Oh. Yeah, I found that really interesting when I read it too. It's interesting you picked up on that, Ralph. Yeah. Learning to live with the one we love. So I always think of it as learning to live with the loss of the one we loved or something. But it's like we still are sort of living with them. And it's sort of this context that we'll go into about how we still have their love carrying.
Let me just, could you ask the beginning if there was something?
Uh-huh.
Comment or whatever, and I was thinking, yes, no, but when I think of, for instance, when I come to class,
Mhm.
I find that it's really a very self-centered, selfish kind of
Mm,
thing to experience, wasn't that way?
right.
Maybe some religion, making up yourself better or something in there, but at some point it becomes like as I said, selfish.
Mm.
Self-centered. And I'm wondering if that's true in grieving.
Um,
process as well. You don't have to address it.
Yeah, no, I will talk about that when we get to depression. We're going to go through each of these individually. But your point that there's a selfish component to depression at times, potentially. I think we can see that that may be the case, but it's not always that selfishness is bad. I mean, I don't want to, and even in Buddhism, when we use this term self-cherishing or self-centeredness, there are elevated states where we are definitely much more centered on ourselves to the neglect of others, and this can become problematic. But there's a lot of just pure concern for one's own well-being that is perfectly fine. The Buddhist beginning point to all of his teachings is that every being is driven by the desire to be happy and to not suffer. And the Buddha never said there was a fault at that level. And that we could say is self-concerned, self-centered. So even sometimes when we're experiencing depression, it might be that, yes, it's all revolving around me, my feelings, my experience of grief, my sadness, what have you. But that may be the pain we need to be in touch with in order to come out of the other side. I think it would be hard to get to a place where we could be of genuine benefit to others if we haven't gone through some sort of self-focus on our own depression and our own sadness at the loss of another. So I don't want to put a value judgment on that, but I think you are right, and there are certainly possibilities for depression becoming too self-centered. Where it actually becomes a bit more of a pattern that we go to day in and day out just to get pity from other people or to feed into our own kind of misunderstood way of living our lives. Because it's, yeah.
This context too.
Yeah.
The grieving process.
And I think that's where it becomes something more like the complicated grief that I mentioned earlier that was spoken of in that book, The Grieving Brain, where we can see that there can be times where it starts circling in on itself, becomes more of a rumination process. They actually use that word a lot in there. Rumination doesn't really serve a whole lot of benefit. If we are continuing to reflect on and hold an awareness of certain things that are positive, that might be valuable. But a lot of ruminating that we do is just simply spiraling down and becoming very narrow in its focus. So if the focus is only on me, myself, and I, and then we can't relate to others, we can't see other aspects of life, well, then obviously it's going to become damaging and dangerous. But again, each of us has to be our own navigator often through these things. We can work with professionals often that have some idea about how to identify what's going on emotionally. But
Thank you.
Let's see. I will talk more about it though, Ralph. Thank you for bringing that up. Let's go on to the final stage or slide I want to share on these 5 stages to begin with. And that's says here, but they are not stops on some linear timeline in grief. Not everyone goes through all of them or goes in a prescribed order. I mean, some people will never experience, for example, the bargaining phase of it, where you're trying to think, well, but what if and what have you. We'll talk about that in a moment. Some of them are maybe not as prevalent in some people. Our hope is that with these stages comes the knowledge of grief's terrain, making us better equipped to cope with life and loss. So this is the idea behind these, and maybe I will share the next 2 slides as well, actually, now that I think about it, because these also give some sort of context for how to work with them. People often think of the stages as lasting weeks or months. They forget that the stages are responses to feelings that can last for minutes or hours as we flip in and out of one and then another. So, there's no timeline, as was said earlier by Rabbi Steve Leader. There's no, it's not a race to be won. It's not like we have to, oh, it's the first year, I have to be over my grief after a year. I remember hearing a lot when I was going through my grieving that a year is an important sort of milestone. And there is something true to that, right? Because in the course of a year, especially when we've lost those who are close to us, we go through every major life event in terms of birthdays, holidays, summer vacations or whatever. You go through everything that you would normally experience with that loved one. And you have to experience that initial in your face absence of them, which is undeniable, again, and an important part of the grieving process. The second year doesn't mean that, okay, I've gone through my year, now I'm in the clear. I don't have to worry about grief any longer. It takes on a different flavor. In fact, I used to describe grief to people that I was talking to during that time as a strange animal that shows up on your doorstep at weird hours of the day, because it shows up and you just kind of go, whoa, where did that come from? Because sometimes it's not even like the 50-cent pieces or something that triggers it. It just shows up. It's there. The one thing I also forgot to mention earlier today when I was talking about the nature of grief is we often even have what's called anticipatory grief. I think someone maybe even brought it up in their comments, but I think it's well worth acknowledging that that's also a form of grieving we go through. I was just with my dear mother. She's 92 now, in August. And every time I leave her now, because of her age, and of course I know from Buddhist teachings that I could die before her. There's no guarantee that she's going to die after me or before me. But I have that feeling of like, this could be the last time I see her. This could be the last, words I say to her in person, my last impression of her, my last hug of, hugging her and what have you. And there's that anticipatory thing of what it's going to be like to experience the loss of my mother. My father died quite some time ago, and I wasn't quite as close to my father as my mother, but that is a part of grief as well. The landscape of grief is that we often are thinking about, oh, wow, what's it going to be like on the other side of that? Or those who are retiring from jobs at some point, you might think, well, what is retirement? To let go of that whole identity that you have of the person who did that particular job, worked for that company or whatever. Again, maybe you're anxious to actually not be working anymore, but nonetheless, there's an element of grief to it. So, and then finally, we do not enter and leave each individual stage in a linear fashion. We may feel one, then another, and back again to the first one. So again, it's more like not even a spiral, it's more like just kind of a zigzag, and you just sort of go all over the place with these five, especially in grieving. Let me talk about them a little bit in regard to death and dying, because I think most of you probably have heard of the 5 stages, but it's good just to review them in that context. So when we have the initial stage of denial, of course, for the person who's been given a prognosis of a particular amount of time, or been told that they have an illness that generally ends in, taking their life. I don't know, we don't use that term terminal illness so much anymore because life is terminal in and of itself, but the idea is a life-threatening illness, something that could potentially lead to the loss of your life. Denial is a natural reaction, right? Why? Because it's hard to take all that information in. It is a natural reaction of defending ourselves and defending our sense of who we are, to refuse that information, to say, no, that can't be true. You must have somebody else's test. This can't be what's actually happening, right? So denial is absolutely a part of it when it comes to, again, the initial way that they found these 5 stages through observation. And it does make sense that comes at the beginning, right? Because we don't want to take that in at all. That information is too much for a lot of people. Once more, I would say with the stages as we approach accepting our own death, there might be some that some people don't go through. If you have a Buddhist practitioner, for example, we all know from most of us from having studied Buddhism that we spend a lot of time thinking about our death. Lama Zopa Rinpoche says every day we should be thinking, I will die today. Not that you're it's not an affirmation. I will die today, I will die, and therefore you die. You say it because you prepare your mind for that reality. Because one day you're going to be right. Most days you're going to be wrong, but one day you're going to be right. And then you'll be ready for it. Because if you've thought that way every day, then you've lived that day as if it was your last day. And you get to the end of the day and you go, okay, I didn't die tonight. I still could die over my sleep. But I'm glad I had another day. I'm going to go to bed, get up tomorrow morning, hopefully, and do it again. And the next day you say, I will die today. You make that day very meaningful. If you have people who practice that way, well, then maybe denial of death doesn't happen. Maybe they get to the prognosis and they go, oh, so that's how it's going to happen. I have to admit, I had a little problem happening with my digestion and a hiatal hernia and that. And I thought, because I had really bad esophagitis, and I thought, oh, that's how it's going to happen. And now I've done medicine, and of course it isn't how it's going to go. Maybe it still is, but it's not right now. But I think we all can maybe have a different mindset if we worked with death and dying day in and day out. But nonetheless, that's the initial stage. Anger. Of course, anger in Buddhism, that's one of our other diluted states of mind that we often have to deal with. But anger can also take a lot of different shapes, right? It can simply be just the refusal to kind of be with that reality, with that fact, in a very sort of resistant way. You know, we have a lot of resistance to taking some things in sometimes. So it's not just the denial can sometimes move into that phase where we simply get very distressed at looking at that reality. And of course, it can take the form of anger, where we get angry and upset at a variety of things. When you're facing your own mortality, for many people, it's anger at any number of causes of why they're in that particular situation. What other people who might be healthy, who were smoking all their life, and yet they ended up getting cancer or what have you. So, like my mother's parents actually lived fairly old for that time. But like they were eating bacon and eggs, every morning for breakfast and all these, rich foods and what have you. And so you can maybe even have that type of anger manifesting where you feel that it's sort of not justified. It's not fair that you're the one that's having to go when everyone else is doing all these horrible things. The third stage is bargaining, where you get into that mentality of a sort of well, what if I did this, or what if we did that? You keep looking for something that's a way out. This too is a self-defense mechanism, right? Because once more, you're still pushing that reality away and you're not letting it come completely in. And now you've maybe gotten through perhaps some of the denial and the anger, but you still think, well, but what if I work with this? And maybe there's a cure there, or maybe there's something I can do, that's different. And of course, that's not bad to have that state of mind. And there might be times when our medical professions are not that advanced. Maybe there are things out there that could actually alleviate the situation. But for many people, it becomes a bit of a futile effort. And all that time spent in bargaining doesn't really do much. Of course, some people with a theistic tradition, if you grew up in a theistic tradition of there being some sort of creator God, you might start bargaining with God, right? Well, if you take this illness away from me, if you take this, all the way from me, then I promise I'll be a much better Christian, or whatever the case might be. Those are sorts of things that come up for people when they're adjusting to the reality of death. And then we have the stage of depression, which obviously is the sadness that can be there when we have to confront that. No, there's not really a way out of it. We are going to have to face that reality. And of course, as I was said earlier, the depression can be there, keep coming back around again and again, because it is sad to confront one's own mortality, just as it's going to, when we talk about grief, it's sad to confront the reality of our loss. And then we finally get to some place of acceptance. And it is important to understand that acceptance doesn't mean that you think it's perfectly fine that this is happening. I mean, it doesn't mean that you've gotten to a place where, like I said, you're almost welcoming it in and saying, oh, I'm so happy that I'm dying. That's not what acceptance looks like. It means that you're no longer in a place where you're going to have that resistance. You are able to allow it in. And of course, if people get through those 5 stages to some degree, or at least get to a place of acceptance, it doesn't mean, again, that all the depression's gone, what have you. It means that at least you're at a place where you've sort of allowed yourself to be with that reality. Then so many more things can happen. This is why David Kessler wrote this book. I actually have to admit, I didn't read all of this book, because in the middle, it got into a whole section about different types of death, the death of a child and the death of a suicide and what have you, and all these. And I found it to be I wanted to get to the meat of it. But anyway, his book's quite interesting. He came out, I think, right around the time of the pandemic starting. And he was actually the one interviewed in that article I mentioned earlier from the Harvard Business Review, that discomfort you're feeling is grief. David Kessler wrote this book on finding meaning as the 6th stage. But of course, you have to get a place where you have to get to that place where you have some acceptance before you can find meaning. we've already alluded to that a little bit earlier about how that's one of the necessary things of grief to get us to a place where we actually transcend and grow and transform from that place of grief. As I said, that's not where you can be right at the beginning. At the beginning, one needs to be validated in their denial, validated in their anger, validated in their bargaining, validated in their depression. And then when they get to a place of acceptance, for many people, it does open the door for, well, okay, here we're talking about those who are given a prognosis of so many months. Well, then they make a strong determination about what they're going to do with the time they have left. How do I make that time most purposeful, most meaningful? Yeah, Jack.
Why do you need to be validated in these stages?
Well, what I mean by validated is I mean that you have to be honored that that's what you're going through, as opposed to me saying, you should be at the 6th stage. You should be finding meaning in this. Like we were talking about earlier, like you wouldn't go to somebody who's just been given a prognosis of stage 4 cancer or something and recognizing that that may very well result in their death to say, oh, this is an amazing thing that you've been given and you can find so much meaning. And they're probably needing to go through their own denial about it, their own anger, all the various stages. You see what I'm saying? I'm just saying that if we don't, by validating, I don't mean that we say they're right in denying it, that it should be denied and it's not going on. What we mean by validating it is I can be okay with your being in denial about it, right? I mean, if we're really giving genuine support to somebody who's going through that process, we don't sit there and, force them to move beyond where they're capable of being. At the beginning, they might need to be through that stage of denial. Because that's, again, a self-defense mechanism to keep us from taking all of that in at one time. And it's hard. People aren't really, again, Buddhist practitioners might be a different story. I would hope that people who've thought about death and dying every day, when they hear something like that, they aren't maybe perhaps as resistant to accepting that reality. But for the average person on the street, I think a lot of people have a lot of denial about the reality of death to begin with, even though they can know that people die. They see the obituaries, they hear about people that they know that died and what have you. They still have a lot of resistance to accepting that reality. Were you going to say something more? No. Yeah.
No, it just reminded me of the time when I remember when I did have some grief.
Oh, really? Jack did have grief. Okay.
Yeah.
Jack's grief. Did you want to talk about it? Or?
No, it was just best friend of mine died. Somebody that literally saved my life.
Oh, wow.
And so
yeah.
I would say, and at the end, he didn't want to see anybody.
Interesting.
He had lung cancer, smoking, and I didn't get to see him because he didn't want it.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, I was very sad.
And it's hard to say where that's coming from of your friend not wanting to see people at the end, because it could be that he's still in one of these stages. It could be that he just really had.
Maybe he didn't like the way he looked or something.
I mean, there is that element to it that people are very self-conscious when they get to that place of,
I mean, he was an eye surgeon. Anybody could see him.
Yeah, I understand.
That
Yeah, these are tough things because we have to, again, respect that as well and say, I'd really love to see you, but I respect that you're not wanting to see people at this point. And yeah, it's hard. But I'm glad that you found that as part of the workshop today. So again, the 6th stage of finding meaning, it looks different for different people, as we were talking about earlier, right? You might have somebody who, decides that with their time remaining, that then they want to do benevolent work, get out there and do charity work or whatever. They want to be a part of that. They want to use their last. I remember my dear friend Elliot, who died about a year after Ed. He had AIDS as well. He decided that when he was confronting his own AIDS diagnosis and his reality that he would die from that eventually, he decided to go into the public schools in San Francisco and be a speaker to the kids about what it's like to have HIV and really inform kids. And the school system was happily welcoming him as a sort of a spokesperson for that disease, to shed a lot of the, hatred and fear and everything that people had towards people with AIDS. Even in the 90s, there was still a lot of that going on. But So again, it's not like there's some sort of, you know, we don't even have to think in terms of really grandiose things. It might just mean that you have to be more loving and kind to the people that are in your life, or try to really relish the moments and cherish the time that you do have. That may be just the way that we find meaning. So that book is an interesting one because it goes into all the dimensions of what we mean by that sixth stage. That is really an important part of it. And it's more important even perhaps when we talk about grieving. When we apply these stages to grieving. Why? Because admittedly, for the person who's facing death, they get through their 5 stages, they get to some level of acceptance. They still have death as like the looming on the horizon, and it's going to impact perhaps what they're capable of doing or what they might be able to see as some deeper meaning. But as I said in those examples, they still could find some way of integrating that. But for grief, although yes, any of us could die at any time, for most of us, it's a longer horizon that we're looking at, right? Because we experience the loss and then we have to go on living our lives for often many, many years after that person has exited from our lives. So there's a much longer window of time when we apply the 5 stages to the grieving process, particularly that last one of finding meaning. So let's talk about these 5 in terms of how they manifest in grief. Keeping in mind, and this was actually brought up by Mary Frances O'Connor in this Grieving Brain book, because I do think that even though in that initial book, as I shared those slides with you, they say right up front, this isn't meant to put them in these neat packages and it's not linear. Nonetheless, the medical profession and caring for the mental health profession and what have you, they tend to still use it as a schema for how people should be progressing. And maybe even do too much of that, like looking at somebody, oh, you're in the denial phase. Oh, you're in but people will float in and out of this even more so with grieving, I think, than with accepting one's own death. Because with grieving, it isn't that linear of a process. It's a zigzaggy sort of process. So denial, what does denial look like? Well, chances are you're not, maybe at that initial point when you hear somebody's died, you might think, no, they didn't. But you do face that reality pretty quick, right? There's the funeral, there's the obituary, there's the things that are in your face that you know that person has died. Or if it's a being that you're with, a pet that you've been there with their death, you know that they've died. You can't deny the reality of that. So in terms of that stage in grieving, they say that it's a bit more symbolic. It's more like it comes out in comments like, oh, I can't believe it happened. It's like a dream. It's like it's not real. And I can say that was definitely a part of my initial grief in losing Ed. I kind of felt like it can't be real. This can't be real. This can't have happened. Now, it's even more the case when someone has lost someone very suddenly, right? Because you didn't have the time to prepare. And of course, when you're preparing for someone's death, like I did with Ed's to some degree, I had known about his illness and where it was progressing for quite some time. I was able to have that anticipatory grief. Anticipatory grief does play that role, kind of getting us into the stage of already grieving, even while the person is still there, and gets us into a place where when it happens, it's perhaps not quite as a shock. I mean, I still don't know how people deal with like parents of kids from these school shootings like in Uvalde and what have you. I don't know how they deal with that kind of grief, where it's like your life, one day you're sending your kid off to school. By the end of that day, they're deceased, in such a horrific way too. It's not like, I don't know. Anyway, that's a whole nother story, but denial does sometimes become that sense of just disbelief. I can't take that in. Once more, a defense mechanism to keep us from having to feel that pain. Secondly, anger. There are many dimensions to anger, just as we see with regard to anger at one's own, impending death. We can get angry at the causes of their death. Sometimes you might look at a loved one who we know maybe they died of lung cancer and they shouldn't have been smoking. And we told them a zillion times not to smoke. And they knew they had all the information that, informed them about this. You might get very angry and upset at the one that we've lost, that they didn't take better care of themselves. We might get angry at the injustice, the unfairness of it, as I mentioned earlier. The inability for us to be able to have stopped it from happening. This sometimes happens, right? Might even have those cases where somebody says, I had a feeling I shouldn't have done this, and sent them there, and then this happened to them. We might get angry and upset at ourselves. That's what guilt is essentially, is when we get angry at ourselves and feel bad that we didn't do something more to stop them from passing away. Like, who made us in charge of that? We don't need to take that on ourselves. As I mentioned earlier, we might even get angry at those who aren't in grief. We might look at others and say, well, you know, you people, you don't even know what I'm going through. And as I did, got kind of angry and upset at my friends who weren't supporting me in the way that I thought I should be. Anger has a lot of ways of manifesting. Anger as a delusion in Buddhism, I mean, some of this does border on that and become part of it, but I still think we can acknowledge that anger also isn't one of those things that we need to see as an enemy. We can learn from our anger and learn when our anger does perhaps become a little too self-centered, just like as Ralph was mentioning, our depression can become very self-centered. And I saw it clearly when I was saying that to my friends, well, you're not taking care of me well enough. Well, that's a justifiable reaction in some ways to what was going on, but it's very self-centered, right? It's only looking at it, I don't know what they were all up to in their lives at that time. They may have other problems that they were dealing with that perhaps were more serious for them than my loss. So again, it gets to be problematic at times. We can say anger in and of itself doesn't necessarily have a negative connotation. It depends upon that state of mind, what we're doing, the thoughts that are behind it, all of that. His Holiness has often said that anger, he doesn't feel, is the right word in English for this emotion that we identify as this destructive affliction. He says, there are justifiable angers in the world, like to get angry at countries where women aren't treated fairly and equal as citizens. I mean, there's nothing wrong with that kind of wanting to rectify situations in the world that are unjust. That's a powerful force in the world, but it's not anger as a delusion. It's a compassionate motivation, right? Now, of course, if it becomes, then we're going to, annihilate all these people who are doing this so that we get them out of the way. We're going to destroy the Taliban so that women in Afghanistan can be back to, getting education and what have you. That's not the right way to channel your anger. It's to try to do things constructively to change things. So His Holiness has always been kind of feeling like anger is not quite the right word, because he would say there are justifiable minds of anger. And I think some of our experience with grief is a state of that. We are feeling our own pain and our hurt and opening to that gradually. It can lashing out at other people might happen. This is another place where I might insert, if you're working with others who are grieving, recognize that at times they may be angry and upset. They may even be angry at you. Don't take it personally. Recognize that this is where that person is at. You don't have to, again, put them into a neat little box. Oh, they're in the anger stage. You just say, oh, this is a moment of anger that I can understand. They've lost somebody very dear to them. I can get why they aren't, the cheeriest, happiest person on the planet right now. So anyway, that's how anger can manifest in many dimensions in terms of the grief process. And again, it can come back around. You might have things that trigger that all of a sudden we're back in that angry place. Bargaining. Here again, I think it tends to be more of this sort of what if thinking, or if only. Maybe with the person who's diagnosed with that illness and they're bargaining, it might be looking at the future and how they might avoid that. With bargaining here, it tends to be a little more past oriented. It's like, well, what if I'd done this, or what if, like, I'm sure these, again, poor parents that have sent their kids to a school where they've been shot down, and the horrific acts. I'm sure they have those thoughts some days. Well, what if I'd only kept my kid home that day? If only I had, da 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 da. And of course, anyway, I don't want to go down that avenue. There's so many different things you can look at, but this sort of bargaining, you say you may not really believe that it's possible for your loved one to come back, but you still go through that game of like trying to say, well, it could have been different. It could have been different. I could have done something more. I mean, even the one cat that we lost earlier this year, I kept thinking, well, maybe if I'd only had taken her to the vet sooner, if I'd only done this sooner, if I'd only done that. Well, the past is the past. We have to sort of let go of that. But once more, see that bargaining is a self-defense mechanism. It's a way that we have of protecting ourselves from the pain of letting that in completely. Because once more, these stages are a necessary part of opening to that grief. If we had to go right, to the end of it, it would be just like a downpour of sadness and, unbelievable depression, I think. We have these sort of release mechanisms. It's sort of like a lock system or something when you're in the canals, you're kind of able to let a little bit in, and then you're able to let a little more in, and able to let a bit more in. And eventually we can experience the fullness of it. But it's natural to have these stages of denial, anger, bargaining. And then even the depression. Sadness and depression are a natural response to loss. I think it's completely understandable that we're going to have that. In fact, I do want to share one little slide here from that book. This is again the one by Elizabeth Kubler-Ross and David Kessler. Our society almost seems to be involved in a stamp out depression campaign. Sometimes intervention is vital, but most of the time we do not allow the normal depression that comes with grief to have its place. So even to what Ralph was saying earlier about, yes, I mean, we can see depression as sometimes being very self-centered, but that's what the person may need at that point to heal, to actually go through that, is to be sad. I have to admit, when I was healing from Ed's loss, I made a little tape. Of course, this is back Dave, mixtapes. I made a mixtape of all the songs that would make me cry. I mean, it was interesting. I was almost wanting to induce that feeling of sadness because I thought it was important that I go to that place. But it wasn't complete sadness. It was tinged also with the love I felt for him. And some of them were songs, like there was one song that I remember that we were playing. This is another little story. It was, I don't know if you recall the film Blade Runner. There was like a love theme in there that Vangelis did the music. He just passed away recently, the musician Vangelis. There's sort of a love theme in there. And there was one night when Ed and I went to a Halloween party and we were playing that in the car on the way there. And I just remember that being a very special night, and that music. The day that he died, I went into the grocery store and that was playing on the loudspeaker. And I was just like, and it's not something that you hear on the radio all the time. I mean, it's kind of a obscure sort of piece of music, and it again just really touched me, and I was like, oh, there's Ed, playing this song for me. So I put that on the mixtape, and I put all these other songs on the mixtape, and I would listen to it frequently. There's nothing wrong with being in that sad place. Maybe I was too much for some of my friends in Chicago, that they didn't want to deal with me being such a a downer or something.
Yeah.
But some of us need that. Some of us are really ready to go to that emotional place of just really feeling the sadness of that loss. It's completely natural. So again, this idea that society just doesn't like people being depressed or sad. We don't like it necessarily. So treating depression is a balancing act, they say. We must accept sadness as an appropriate, natural stage of loss, without letting an unmanaged ongoing depression leach our quality of life. And I think this is the balancing act we have to see. If we're getting to a place where we're just staying home all the time with the lights down and, playing the music that makes us cry and whatever, well, then we're not living our lives really. And that can be a healthy stage at one point, but it becomes unhealthy if it perhaps goes too far. But we have to also be the judge of when it's gone too far. I mean, others might be able to look at us and say, well, Don, I don't think you should be doing that now, but they may not know. Their advice may be, oh, well, it's not soon enough and I'll just continue doing this. But their advice may also be, well, I can see that. Maybe it's time for me to let that go. But I think our society in general does have a tendency to want to sort of block all of that off and not, have people around us who are sad, who are, in a place of mourning, of, active grieving. So I think we have to, again, acknowledge that that's part of it. Any comments on depression or what we're talking about here? Yeah, Fatima.
So I think therapy helped me with this. My therapist asked me, or kind of guided me into like, she was like trying to figure out, she was like, what are your views on your depression? And I hadn't thought about it like that, but she helped me change my relationship to my depression in a depressive episode. And that really helped things, because for me, it became like an indicator of there's something wrong. Like, and now I know, like, this is a lagging indicator that things have probably been wrong for a long time. Like during the pandemic, I went through a bout of depression, and it was really helpful that was really helpful reframe, I think, for me. But what is this trying to teach me? And a lot of it was my habits aren't great. I'm not reaching out to the people that maybe, like, I'm lacking that connection that I used to have kind of naturally. So I have to go out and seek more of that and just take like little steps every day to sort of, but I was like looking at depression as a signal that something is wrong, or maybe many things are wrong. and looking at it kind of as a companion. So now I look at it as a companion, not as a
Wow.
something to like fight. It's just like, what are you here to teach me this time?
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's a wonderful way to look at it. It's kind of in line with what we were talking about at lunch, that, when we see that something is, we have to fight against it,
Mhm.
then we don't welcome it in to see what it has to teach us. Mhm. And so, yeah, our depression can be a companion on the path. Absolutely. As I said earlier, even, I mean, the fact that we go through this, we can then be more empathetic with others. We can understand that depression is showing us our own vulnerability, our own, kind of weak points that we need to be attentive to, and also see in others and acknowledge that and be willing to help them in the space of their depression, their sadness. So there's a lot that we can learn from these things. Again, I'm not trying to, code it in a way that we don't recognize there are sometimes interventions that might be necessary. They go to, in that book on grief and grieving, and a lot into, the necessity at times of administering medicine, what have you, antidepressants, things that will help people.
I use
And-
medicine.
And there's nothing wrong with those things too. I mean, we are dealing with a physiological component to our being, as well as a mental component. So we can't deny that. But there is a tendency to perhaps overprescribe, and people to immediately throw a pill at something when it's just a natural part of us living lives to be depressed at times, and especially when we're grieving, to recognize that depression is a part of the equation. Venerable Robina, in one teaching I heard from her, she said, you take your medicine and you do your meditation, you do your practice. There's nothing wrong with these things kind of being done in tandem. We don't need to have this sort of either or, either I'm a completely spiritual being free of all that, or I'm a completely, buying into the Western way of treating things. We do both. If we need both, we do both. So, but I think the point was being raised here primarily around not wanting to, think that that's the way that we should always deal with depression. It's the other side of it that you mentioned, of seeing what depression has to teach us, changing our relationship with it. Yeah, Carly, were you going to share something too?
I think I forgot.
Oh, okay, sorry.
So, yeah.
Well, if it comes back, Oh,
Don,
yes.
also for me, what Ralph was saying, the person might appear to be selfish. The same way, because as you were saying, there's a physical part, like the brain might be irritated. I mean, when you have a loss, there's all these chemicals, cortisol, and the brain is irritated. The same way you wouldn't tell my husband that suffers from the heart that he's lazy. Or do you understand me?
Right. Yeah.
Right? Because yes, depression, when people suffer from depression, it's major. It's
Yeah.
right. We have to. They may appear selfish, but that's the best they can do.
Mm-hmm. No, I think that's where, again, that's a form of validation too, to validate that where people are at is where they're at. And again, it doesn't mean that we don't have any concern for them. And I think our concern just always has to be couched within an understanding of where they're at. And if you are dealing with somebody, this is why going through these stages is important for our own experience of grief, but it's also important so that we know when others are grieving around us, we can identify that this is a natural part of grieving, and we don't have to be kind of putting a label on it of, oh, depression bad, And depression is just a part of the process. It's natural for us to feel sadness when we've lost beings close to us, when we've lost a relationship, when we've lost a job, when we've lost, our youth, whatever. And it's natural for people to go through this. It can become complicated. And obviously that's, again, a part of it that we do have to acknowledge. And in Buddhist terms, we could say part of that complication, as I mentioned earlier, can come from self-centeredness and attachment and all the various things that are problematic in our minds that the Buddha says we do need to rectify. But once more, they are also learning opportunities when we can start to see our own stuff, embrace that, yes, I'm a prideful being, I'm an attached being, I'm whatever. Buddhism is never about sort of isolating these things out and seeing them as something foreign, but recognizing that we have those. They're a part of us too, and they have valuable lessons to teach us. Anything else on depression? Again, this is a big word, depression. I mean, we use it in a very kind of clinical way, but it's anything in that sort of range of sadness, sorrow, some down feeling, can be, very slight and it can be very large. Just really depends.
I will share
Yeah.
another experience I had lately. In the months bridge in 2020, 2021. I spent 7 months in Nashville, Tennessee, taking care of my sister. She was breast cancer, went through chemo and a double mastectomy, and she tested negative, whatever, everything's done. I come back to Florida, and it wasn't until a couple months ago. I was just thinking of her. All of a sudden, I got really sad
Mm.
and I started to cry. But I noticed something different. It wasn't about her. I was like, what's going on? I was actually grieving for myself. I was feeling sad or upset about my experience that I went through, the terror that I felt, the responsibility of taking care of her.
Right.
All of that stuff, all of a sudden kind of like hit me in sadness and in grief. It was really interesting.
Thanks for sharing that, Rob. Yeah. I mean, that often happens. I can say it happened to some degree with me. Of course, it ended with the death of my partner, but when you're in a caregiving mode, it's stressful, and it is a lot of relegating your own needs and things to the inferior position and putting them in the superior position and caring for them because that's what's required, that's what's needed. And of course, everyone says you have to take care of yourself in the midst of caring for others, but oftentimes it doesn't happen until afterwards, and you had the opportunity to be a benefit and then to later have the experience of grieving and feeling some sadness and what have you at that. I think it's perfectly natural. Again, we often do things, very good intentions, wonderful things that we do, but there are consequences of that that sometimes surface further down the road. Yeah, these are interesting lives we lead. All the various stuff that can come up.
And
Are you
it's
gonna?
hard too,
Uh-huh.
when we're not taught about death growing
Yeah.
up,
Yeah,
and it should be taught in school, and I'm sure now it's starting to be taught in school.
I don't know. I mean, I would hope that the kids would be coming in because they've seen loss happen from the pandemic much more than they see in their everyday life, right? You would think many of them have. So maybe they come into the classrooms and bring up the topic of death more so that then it ends up being discussed. But I worry that our schools are so regimented around what they need to do and all the exams they need to prepare kids for and all this sort of basic knowledge that they need to have, that they haven't become holding places for those types of discussions, unfortunately. I mean, I would hope that His Holiness has felt like we need a real shift in our education system and more of what he calls a secular education around all these topics and values, compassion, all these things that really need to be taught that aren't necessarily being taught at home because parents are very busy and working all day and not necessarily instilling those values in their children or knowledge in their children. And in the schools, there's too much of that type of, regimented thinking, that we're preparing kids for their education they need when they're going to pursue a career and all these things. So I don't know, were you thinking otherwise or?
I was just thinking, how much easier it would have been.
Yeah.
I lost a lot of friends in my early 20s, and I was never taught about death, just my grandma and grandpa when I was 11.
Right.
So it was just really hard because
I'm sure.
I had no idea about it.
Right.
And they were all sudden.
Right. Just no way to kind of process that and work with that. Yeah. I don't know. I think it's hard. I mean, everybody wants to sort of shelter people from this sort of knowledge. Now we've gotten into this place where, not just with COVID and what's happened there, but the school shootings and the reality of death and dying there. And you would think that there'd be more attention to it and an ability to discuss these things, but maybe everybody still feels like it's not appropriate for kids to talk about this stuff. But if it's happening to their own classmates, I don't know. It's a hard one.
Yeah, and I feel like too, as a culture, we're also kind of in denial about
Absolutely.
what's really going on, and also just going back to, really being so out of touch with our own feelings and needs. And if we're not in touch with those things, how can we teach or learn how to educate others about it?
Yeah, the blind leading the blind kind of.
My daughter's reaction was adorable. The 4-year-old said, "Oh yeah, that's a casket. When you're dead, you put that in, you bury it in the ground." That's who taught her that.
Oh, Jack.
I think it's something you need to know. Like,
Yeah.
and even as an adult, I dealt with death, but kind of once removed. So, so I grew up a Sufi Muslim, and like one of the things that you do when someone dies is you wash the body, like the close family members.
Mhm.
And when my aunt passed away, my youngest cousin, and she's only 25, and she's still very young, like developmentally. And so I was talking to my eldest cousin, and he was saying, like, should she be there to do that? And it's like, this is her time to say goodbye. And we're after just like being with her mother after, you know, the life that left her body was, that gave her some sense of closure. But now people, they die in hospitals and away from everyone, and then you don't see the body until the funeral. And even then,
Mhm.
you know, we put everything in boxes. And like we're just a few steps removed, and we don't see it anymore, you know. So it makes it scarier. It was like the unknown is always scarier than the known. So there's something to that we should be sort of addressing, just for everyone, not just for children, but for adults too.
Absolutely. Oh, it's a very good point. I know as a child, I wasn't prepared to, my grandparents, my father's parents, they died very close together. I think we were on the way up to Wisconsin for my grandfather's funeral, and my brother and I, we were just having a good time. We thought we were going on a road trip, you know, and my dad was really sad, and he actually yelled at us at one point. He said, "You kids, stop it. You don't know what's happening." Blah, blah, blah. You know, he never informed me and never gave me any context for that. So it's kind of, yeah. You know, so I do agree that in times past, certainly there was a lot more, and in many other cultures, there's a lot more done to accept the reality of dying, for people to be there through the death, after the death, being with the body. In Tibetan Buddhism, just so you know, many of you may already know this already, but we have a whole recommendation of allowing the body to sit untouched for 3 days after, you know, and so you allow, of course, you might have to get like dry ice and things to keep things, you know, from becoming too ripe, if you want to use that word. But anyway, it's a wonderful period for people to come and sit with the body and do prayers. And of course, it's for that. It's not so people can come and have, you know, lament and cry and, you know, grab at the body and whatever, drink whiskey, like an Irish wake.
My grandmother had given orders before she died that she wanted traditional Irish wake in the house.
In a traditional
So they did that.
with the dead body there,
With
yeah.
the traditional dinner coffin in the front hall of the house
Uh-huh.
for 3 days. For
Oh.
the traditional 3 days of the wake.
No,
And I was like 8 or 9 at the time. It was really a wonderful introduction
Yeah.
to death.
no, no, because you actually, yeah, it doesn't
So she
shelter.
was there. And the company came in every night, all the relatives came in every night, you know, to sit there and visit and
Yeah.
have a party basically, and it was a wonderful, you
Yeah.
know, introduction. And they're quite long stories.
Yeah.
Of course. Because my grandmother.
Yeah. See, and that's where, like, going back to my experience with my dad's father, when we get up to Wisconsin, then we could get dropped off at the other grandparents, and they went to the funeral without us, you know, so they didn't even take us to the funeral or anything, you know, so it was just like this weird sort of, well, we don't want you to know about it, but we want you to understand what we're going through. And it's like, well, what do you do with that? So,
They don't want you to know, but we want you to feel bad.
yeah, so I don't know. I think we're definitely in need of, but every one of us perhaps has to make some sort of changes in our own approach to it. Again, educate ourselves, be aware ourselves, and try to keep others in our lives open to all of that as much as we can. I mean, I'm hoping the pandemic, if nothing else, did bring the reality of death home to a lot more people, and the uncertainty of how this can go south very quickly. We all saw it in many, many people. So, but yeah, a lot needs to happen in that territory. Let's go on to talk about the stage of acceptance. Again, it doesn't mean that you're all right with what happened. That's not where you kind of get to a place of, oh, I'm perfectly fine with this loss that I have in my life. It means that you acknowledge the hole's still there, as Marianne said, you know, the hole in your heart is still there. But you've come to a place of acknowledging that reality at a deeper level. It doesn't mean that the other stages can't still crop up again. You might still get depressed. You might still have some anger, but you at least are accepting the reality of that and knowing that this is something that you can perhaps learn from, live with that reality of the loss, move on from there, if you will. I mean, I was told by somebody, I don't remember who this was, that in your first year of grieving, you shouldn't make any major life decisions. Why? Because you're probably not in the best place to have a good kind of awareness of what that is. What is it like? I remember I do have one recollection of my brother's wife. She passed away, unfortunately, really very suddenly about 6 years ago. My brother's wife was talking to me, and I was feeling like I wanted to have a child. I've never had that thought of having a child before. As a gay man, you don't really think about it that much. So some gay men do. I mean, it's not like can't be that exclusionary, but so I was talking to my sister-in-law, and she was like, "Oh, I'll have a child for you." I'm like, "Whoa, we're going." Of course, I don't know what my brother would have said. They didn't even have their own children then. So, but there was something, and I think where it was coming from for me was I'd been caring for Ed, and I was like wanting someone to care for. Get a pet; it's a little bit easier. But there's a lot that happens in this when we get to maybe even a place where we're accepting that we have to recognize that maybe we still have to be a little cautious in what we're doing. And a year is a good timeline in some regard, but don't think that, again, anything's cast in stone. Many people will find it's a number of years, again, particularly with very sudden losses in your life, things that you need to process a little bit longer. So acceptance is important to kind of get to eventually. We do have a sharing from the chat box. I'll read this unless you'd like to come in to say it, Penny. It says, my mom passed away 43 years ago, and I still have vivid memories of her death. However, there is acceptance over time. Oh, good. I know it's very hard. I mean, even when it's 43 years, I was saying, the loss of my partner was 30 years ago. And those decades, although they're decades, they are water under the bridge, more time that we've, got between them. The loss can still be very vivid, and the reality of recalling that can still be very vivid. But
Living with the ones we love.
yeah, we are still living with the ones we love. And this is kind of what we're going to go into and talking about, how we still can take some of the things that we are trying to practice in Buddhism and hold on to them in the midst of that, kind of see that there still is something we can carry forward that is very positive. The love carries on, the love continues on. So when we get to a place of acceptance, it's not like we shut the door on that person or that episode of our life and just say, that's all completely gone. I don't even have to think about it ever again. We continue to have them in our lives, or to even have that experience. And as I mentioned earlier, perhaps some gratitude for them. Yes, I mean, no relationship is perfect. I'll admit Ed and I didn't have a perfect relationship. Most people don't have perfect relationships. But I can be very grateful for what I had. And even grateful for the imperfect parts, because there's also lessons there too, again, that we can live with and grow from. So let me share one little quote that I had from the On Grief and Grieving, from on this topic of acceptance, that I think is kind of nice to share. As we heal, we learn who we are and who our loved one was in life. In a strange way, as we move through grief, healing brings us closer to the person we love. It's an interesting thought to entertain, how even they're no longer present in our lives, how perhaps we get closer over time through our healing.
Because
Yeah,
I think,
Carly.
you think we have so much time with everyone,
Mm,
so when they're gone, you realize you cherish.
mhm.
you
And you do tend to focus perhaps on the good things about it. As I said, we don't have perfect relationships with beings, but nonetheless, we do learn to cherish those wonderful times that we had and the love that we had for them and what have you. There is this whole concept that our relationship changes in a way to where we have sort of a new love in our lives. That love sort of transcends what we had experienced. I think there was one quote from here that I wanted to share. Was that? Should have marked it better. Ah, here it is, love. Let me take it off screen for a moment while I read this. So this is from the Grieving Brain book, page 186. She says, after a loved one dies, they are clearly no longer with us in the physical world, which each day proves to us. On the other hand, they are not gone, because they are with us in our brain and in our mind. The physical makeup of our brain, the structure of our neurons, has been changed by them. In this sense, you could say that a piece of them physically lives on. That piece is the neural connections protected within our skull, and these neural connections survive in physical form even after a loved one's death. So they are not entirely out there, and they are not entirely in here either. You are not one, not two. That is because the love between two people, that unmistakable but usually indescribable property, occurs between two people. Once we have known love, we can bring it into our awareness. We can feel it emerge and emanate from us. So again, it's kind of interesting. She's looking at it from a neurological point of view, that what the imprints we have in our the neural imprints, whatever, of that person are still there. But mentally, we see that this is true as well. We carry forward with that being incorporated into who we are. Yeah, you're going to say something more
Yeah,
too.
no, it's a physical thing.
Yeah.
Weird.
Yeah. Yeah,
Yeah.
please.
The way that I think about everybody actually is that they're a mirror, right? Everyone's a mirror of different things for us, because it's just that, I don't know, that's just how I think about it. And I recently lost a friend, and not to death, it's strange to, but I lost my oldest friendship, and that was really tough, and it was over something I never thought that you could lose a friend over.
Mhm.
And it's been difficult for me to sort of decouple like who he's become now and who he was when we first met for like the 16 years after. So there was something that happened and he changed, and that, kind of broke off our relationship. I was having trouble getting rid of pictures. I was trying to get rid of any sort of like energetic connection, to him. And I was talking to my therapist about it, and she's like, well, that was a different version of him. And like, he used to be my mirror. So when I didn't know, like, there's times I think in like, for me at least, like where I forget who I am and, like the core of me, but he was always the person that could remind me. And then to lose that was really tough. And I had to like kind of go through those stages of like, okay, what was I getting from this person? Because I'm trying to patchwork him together with like other people. It's not working. But he was that mirror for me. And so it's a different, I think, form of grief. It's a different variation of grief. It's like grieving somebody that's still alive. But I think, yeah, it's people are mirrors for things that we need or want or, have grown accustomed to in our lives.
Definitely. Yeah. And that can be a big hole in our lives when we no longer have that person that reflects that back.
Yeah.
It's important to acknowledge all the different ways that we do experience grief and loss. One thing, and on this whole topic of like love, and that I think it was David Kessler in his book, he uses this word bursts. We sometimes think of waves, like waves of grief. He calls them grief bursts. Bursts. It's a weird word to say, in the plural in particular. But then he also says intermingled with those grief bursts are also love bursts. And so that's where once more we can see that these two intertwine with each other, love and grief. I remember certainly in my own grieving process that there would be those tender moments too, where I just think of Ed, and yes, there's an element of grief, but it's moved more into just recollecting the love, recollecting that heartfelt connection. So again, just acknowledge that those are also part of the landscape of grief, is that we do have those flare-ups at times when things come in. And just to see them and accept them, welcome them in, see what they have to teach us. So we haven't gotten to the 6th stage yet with regard to this process of applying this to grief. The 6th stage, once more, is added on by David Kessler of finding meaning. And that's really what we're going to be addressing the rest of the time we have, is kind of how do we use our own experience of grief and grieving, or even observing others, to reinforce our commitment to this path. But meaning in and of itself is something that, again, hopefully for most people, they go through some sort of, grieving process, get to a place of acceptance, and do use it as a springboard to be able to find deeper meaning in their life. I know that there is this concept in Buddhism. I'll put it up on the screen here. My next little quote from Pema Chodron, I think, is the next one coming up. Oh, sorry. Well, this is similar to what we were just talking about. A new relationship begins. We learn to live with the loved one we lost. We start the process of reintegration, trying to put back the pieces that have been ripped away. And this is, again, just on that whole theme of acceptance. This is the quote from Pema Chodron from the book. I started rereading this book when the pandemic started. It was such a perfect title, When Things Fall Apart. She says, our whole world falls apart, and we've been given this great opportunity. It's this concept, we often use this term in Buddhism, Tibetan Buddhism in particular, called Lojong. Lojong is mind training. All of Buddhism is mind training, really. I mean, because everything is working with our minds. But this is the concept that anything that comes into our life, even the worst possible situation, is an amazing wellspring of spiritual opportunity. And so when everything falls apart, when you get a divorce and the cat runs away, and you get cancer and you lose your job, I mean, if you were to pile all those things on, you'd be like the richest person in the world. You have the greatest opportunity. Once more, this is not something to tell somebody who's newly grieving. You have this amazing opportunity. Can't you see it? Are you blind? So this is a wonderful phrase for us who are in the know and wanting to practice this way. But if you're not in the know, please know that this is revolutionary stuff. This is like, university level learning compared to kindergarten, grade school learning that most people are at when they're initially in a state of grief or confronting problems, difficulties in their lives. So when you're working with others, this isn't the first thing to run back to, and say, oh, I have this perfect advice. It's called Lojong, and you need to learn how to transform this manure into, gold. It just doesn't happen that easily for most people. So that's what she's referring to here, is this whole process. But from David Kessler's book on this sixth stage, Finding Meaning, he says, bad days don't have to be your eternal destiny. That doesn't mean that your grief will get smaller over time. It means that you must get bigger. I mentioned this phrase earlier in response to what Marianne had shared. And I kind of like that perspective, because it acknowledges that the grief we sort of carry with us, it's like the hole in our heart that is always going to be there, but we just become bigger. We just have a grander, more, I don't know, what's the right word for it? Magnanimous way of being in the world. We just learn to go beyond that. And hopefully that happens to some degree. As I said, it's not going to be identical for everyone. Some people may find themselves dedicated to new efforts, new things that come out of that. Some people may simply want to relish and cherish what they have. Some people may want to put more energy into their spiritual practice. As Buddhist practitioners, I would hope that most people would want to do that, or whatever your spiritual path is, that you say, this is a wake-up call for me. Confronting my own mortality through seeing the mortality of others, confronting my own impermanence at seeing impermanence in the world around me. This is a very important window of opportunity. And so therefore I can grow and develop from it and not be completely identified with that loss. And so here's that wonderful phrase, as the saying goes, no mud, no lotus. The most beautiful flower grows out of the mud. Our worst moments can be the seeds of our best moments. They have an amazing power to transform us. So he used that phrase there. Again, the first person I heard having used it was Thich Nhat Hanh in the title of one of his books. This is, again, that idea of Lojong. I don't think it is revolutionary, but I don't think it's that outrageous when it comes down to it. I think that a lot of people actually live their lives this way. And I occasionally watch the evening news, and they'll have those nice little wholesome stories at the end. They've been throwing all this garbage at you of everything going wrong in the world. And then they go, oh, and then we have this delightful little story of this person who did this. And oftentimes they're that sort of story, somebody who has been kind of put into a situation where they've had something really awful happen to them, and they've made something wonderful out of it. That phrase of, when you're given lemons, make lemonade type of thing. So I know that our culture has this concept. It's not easy to do. But if we get to a place of acceptance with our own grief, then perhaps we do see that as a doorway through which we can say, I want to make sure that the rest of my life is meaningful, is purposeful in whatever I do. So what we're going to look at for the remaining time that we have is these a set of teachings, and it's just like 3 things, but they are really the heart of all of the Buddhist path to enlightenment. Lama Tsongkhapa identified these as what he calls the three principal aspects of the path. What he means is that if we were to cull down everything that is in the path to enlightenment, which I obviously don't have time to go through today, the entire stages of the path, what we call the Lam Rim in Tibetan, we could talk about every one of those teachings and perhaps discuss how they apply. But nonetheless, I think to some degree, Guy Newland touched on each of these just in some manner in his book, Buddhist Grief Observed, and I want to share my own reflections on them. But they are what Lama Tsongkhapa said are the three main mindsets that we have to develop in order to kind of fulfill the basic requirements of the path. One is what this word that in English we use the word renunciation. It's a strange word because in the West it has a very different connotation, I think, than perhaps what we mean here. But so the first one is renunciation. I'll give you all three and then I'll go through them one at a time. The second is bodhicitta. Bodhi, B-O-D-H-I, chitta, C, it's usually spelled C-H-I-T-T-A. I think in the Sanskrit it's a C with a diacritical mark on it that makes it the ch sound. But bodhicitta is the mind, chitta, of bodhi, of awakening. So this is where we develop that intention to benefit others to the greatest degree. Anyway, I'll talk more about that in a moment. The third of these three principal aspects that I'm going to go into are what's called the correct view of emptiness, or the wisdom of emptiness. So if you take everything that the Buddha taught in terms of this Mahayana path, this path that is intent upon becoming enlightened to benefit all beings, those are the three main mindsets. So let's talk about them in the context of grief. So I think it is important that we say, okay, how do I frame my grief and work with my grief in the context of each of these three principal ideas? Why not? And we'll start there. So the very first one, renunciation. As I said, renunciation is kind of a strange word in English. I mean, when I first heard it, I was thinking, like you're going to put on sackcloth and starve yourself, go out into the woods and just eat berries or something. I mean, that's how we often think of the renunciate, the person who's sort of renounced life and gone off to this idyllic sort of spiritual hermit existence. But that's not what it looks like for most people. It's a mindset. It's not something physical. Now, there might be some benefit at times in our life, at least, of shutting ourselves off from perhaps the daily concerns of life and what have you. There's nothing wrong with that. But that's not the measure of whether a renunciate or not. The measure of whether you have developed renunciation or not is whether you've generated the compassionate concern for yourself to the greatest degree. I often equate renunciation, and even Lama Yeshe would do this. I never knew Lama Yeshe, but I read some of his teachings where he equates it with self-compassion. And of course, those of you who know the Lam Rim, this is the first two stages of the Lam Rim, where we look at our own situation. We see our own suffering. We see what we are caught up in, again, what the Buddha called samsara. Samsara is the idea that through the force of our own crazy minds, our own deluded consciousness, we create karma that propels us from existence to existence. And we just keep carrying those deluded states of mind from life to life. And as long as that cycle is going on, as long as that's all that we're doing, we're never going to know any true liberation. We're never going to have any true peace. Never going to attain what they call moksha, this liberated state. And the idea of renunciation is that we have to want that for ourselves first. We mentioned bodhicitta. Bodhicitta is where we want it for all beings. We want all beings to be free of that and to achieve their greatest potential. But for renunciation, it's simply looking at yourself. It's being compassionate towards yourself. When you talk about spiritual bypassing, and I mentioned earlier, when I first came to the Buddhist path because of all my involvement in all these efforts around, compassionate concern for others, I wanted to skip right over all of I don't want to, deal with my own stuff and my own karma and all this and death and rebirth. I just want to go right to compassionate concern for others. Practice Tonglen, all these amazing practices, right? We can't do that. You have to have concern for yourself, or how can you have genuine concern for others? If we're sitting here saying, I want all beings to become enlightened, but we aren't thinking that we ourselves are deserving of that or even need to get that, well, then what's the point? We're a sentient being. We're a suffering sentient being. And if you're going to use your own suffering to then be able to acknowledge the suffering of others, then it's of great benefit, right? Because if we see clearly our own situation, then we can look at everyone else and see they're in the exact same boat. Remember that phrase was batted around a lot during the pandemic, right? We're all in this together. We're all in the same situation. Not just talking about the pandemic, talking about samsara. Every being is in the same process, according to the Buddha, under the control of their karma delusions, going from life to life, circling in samsara. So our grief is a doorway through which we can open up to that reality, to see that we're suffering beings like everyone else. That's why, again, I didn't mention this earlier, but Guy Newland in this book at the very beginning, he talks about this. And maybe some of you who've experienced some deep grief can get this. He says, sometimes grief is about that isolating sense of specialness that we might have. I know that this was part of where my reactions were coming at towards my friends during that time when I was grieving, was that there's something special about my status then of being a grieving person. I'm kind of in that unique world that they couldn't understand. And it is a sense of specialness that we get, perhaps. It's a bit diluted from that perspective. But he says it's about awakening from the delusion that our pain is a private prison. Your pain is not some private prison. It's a prison we're all in. We're all inmates, okay? It's a pretty big penitentiary, all right? We're all there and we're all still imprisoned. And until you get rid of the causes of being imprisoned, you're never going to be free. But we have to initially want that freedom for ourselves. And we do have to be able to acknowledge our own personal pain. And that's the doorway through which we can then see the pain of others. I'm going to share one little quote. I don't know if there's anything. Oh, was this? Yeah, this was. I'm sorry, I missed this, Penny. Can it be the karmic thread? Oh, what was I talking about then? I'm sorry, I missed it when it came up at 1:13. That was a long time ago. Oh, I was talking about maybe what goes from life to life. Oh, love. Okay. Yeah, I don't know. I think that love is a form of karma. Love is a mental thought that we strengthen and carry forward. Love is karma, a karma. So absolutely. Let me share this other quote. And if there's more thoughts that come up on that, we're going to talk about love perhaps a little bit more in just a moment when we get into bodhicitta. But I want to share this passage from Guy Newland's book. The quotes I'm going to share for the remainder of today, I think, are mostly from Guy Newland. He says, to love others, we must love ourselves, wish well for ourselves, and then gradually learn to see others as similar cases of beings who, just like ourselves, want happiness and don't want suffering. But the first step, loving ourselves, can be notoriously hard. I know that as many times as I introduce various teachings and say you have to start with yourself, and I doubt that most people go home and actually do that. We do tend to be focused on caring for others and think that that's the way to be a good human being, but we don't think about caring for ourselves in a genuine way. Yeah, it might get kind of selfish at times. We might get very self-centered in our caring for ourselves and think I'm just going to pamper myself to death by, filling myself with my existence with all sorts of wonderful things. That's not real genuine self-concern. Genuine self-concern, according to the Buddhist teachings, is getting these teachings of what the predicament is that we're in and wanting ourselves to be free from that. That's what renunciation is. Clearly understanding that we are involved in something that's unsatisfactory and wishing to remove ourselves from that. The word for renunciation in Tibetan is nyenjong. Nyenjong means definite emergence. It means that you are definite and certain to emerge from this crazy nonsense we've been involved in since beginningless time. It's the really strong mind. It's where your path really starts. They say actually once you develop renunciation at that deep degree, where you live from that place of renunciation all the time, that's the beginning of your path. And the real path, where you are actually practicing what will get you out of here. But you have to have that strong motivation to get out of here before you can begin the process of getting out. So there's a whole set of teachings that support this. They're the first two levels of the stages of the path. I won't go into all of them. I mentioned karma earlier. Karma. Guy Newland mentioned that again. The karma teachings weren't so helpful to him, and I think they're a kind of difficult one to apply to grief. We can understand that everything is a karmic occurrence. And that is part of understanding how we get out of this, is because we simply create a different karma. You create different actions, different thoughts, different behavior that you engage in on the basis of those thoughts. All of that happens when you begin to develop these mindsets. But renunciation is the doorway that you have to go through to begin that process of really doing the heavy duty lifting, and the real work that's going to get you out of samsara. Now, there is a path that the Buddha taught. It's usually called the Hinayana, or the individual vehicle. For those who, that's the extent of the burden they can bear, is their own suffering and getting themselves out of samsara. And there's nothing wrong with that. It's just that bodhisattvas who are on the Mahayana path go on to develop this second state of mind, the second principal aspect, which is bodhicitta, which is where they see, as Guy Newland was saying in that slide, that we want to generate even this concern for others by seeing that they're just like us, exactly like us in very fundamental ways. But you have to start by looking at yourself, but you don't stop there. Those who are intent on achieving their own liberation, they will just simply strengthen that mind of renunciation and eventually extricate themselves from samsara. And how wonderful, they attain nirvana, the state of peace. But for the bodhisattva, that state of peace is not where they want to go. That's actually seen as undesirable because they want to develop themselves fully. In Mahayana Buddhism, we talk about Buddha nature, meaning that every being has the potential to develop themselves to that degree. We look at ourselves and think we're just such miserable little masses of whatever, and don't have any potential at all. Every one of us is walking around with this like storehouse, this treasury of amazing potential. And that's what Buddha nature essentially is. It's a wonderful course on Buddha nature. I think I taught it here some years ago. Maybe I'm not sure if you were director then. I think Rebecca may have been director, but did a little encapsulated version of it. They use like 9 different similes. Buddha nature is like this. One of them is it's like a gold statue that is encrusted in filth. So if you imagine like all this, mud and manure and whatever that's all around this gold statue. Well, we don't see it, right? The gold statue's in there, but you have to know that it's in there to go seeking it out and bring it forth, make it manifest. So the idea is that we tend to identify with all the muck, all the dirt, all of the garbage, and we don't see that we have this pure, pristine Buddha nature within us. So bodhicitta is based on the concept that every being has Buddha nature. The explanation of Buddha nature, when it comes down to, we say there's 2 aspects to it. The one I'm going to focus on is what we call our conventional Buddha nature, which is the fact that our minds can be transformed from this, kind of messed up sort of situation into a perfect purity that is there in its potential. The analogy that's often used is a glass of water. So if I take my glass of water here and imagine that I go out, and I get some dirt from one of the gardens here or whatever, and I pile the dirt into the water, right? Mix it up. So the clarity of the water is gone then, right? The water becomes opaque. Can't see the clarity at all. But is the clarity really gone? It's kind of there in a non-manifest way, right? Because if I take that dirty water and I run it through a filter, maybe several times, you have to do, several processes to get all of the fine things. First a coarser filter, then a subtler filter, and then a really fine filter. Then the clear water returns, right? It was always sort of there in a non-manifest way. That's like our Buddha nature. Every single mind of a being is clear in that way. It has its own fundamental clarity and purity. It's just polluted in the moment. We use this term adventitious pollutions or adventitious stains. The idea is that they're there because you haven't done the purification. You haven't removed them. And we know that they're removable. Why? Because we don't always have the mind of anger, right? We don't always have the mind of jealousy. Those minds are there based on causes and conditions. Certain things arising, and then our jealousy comes into play, and then the jealousy goes away, and maybe something else comes into play. It's the nature of our minds to have this sort of things manifesting on the basis of causes and conditions. If we change those causes and conditions, we can actually remove everything that is impure, and the natural purity of the mind can come forward. So a Buddha's mind is simply a being who's done that work. They've completely removed what is negative, and they've developed, moreover, all the positive qualities. So a Buddha is imbued with this perfect loving kindness and compassion. So bringing this back around to grief work and to how we are kind of working with our own situation of grief. It's a wonderful doorway, as I said earlier, to knowing the suffering of others, to being able to open to our potential to develop ourselves to that degree to where we would be able to benefit others in a most, incredible way. A Buddha is a being who is imbued with all those perfect qualities of kindness and compassion and wisdom, but also is manifesting in the world to help them. We don't even know who's a Buddha. I often joke with people, maybe it's not a joke, I don't know, that all of you could be Buddhas for all I know. You're all just showing up here to pretending to be students so you can help me on my path of awakening. It's taken me a while, sorry, doing the best I can. We don't know who's a Buddha. Joe Biden may be Buddha, Donald Trump may be a Buddha. We don't know. I mean, sometimes you can think, well, because they're engaging in particular actions, maybe they're not a Buddha. But we don't know absolutely for sure. Because even the Buddha himself, various lifetimes might have manifested in ways that may not have looked at their like the most compassionate thing. But nonetheless, every one of us can become that, can become this force in the world that can help others on their path of awakening. That's what bodhicitta is. It's the mind that is intent upon becoming a Buddha so we can help others to realize that potential. It's the most precious mind. If that's all that we're able to do of this life, is to develop bodhicitta to a stronger degree and come out of this life with a sincere wish to benefit others to that degree, that's wonderful. It's of course motivated by compassion and loving kindness, seeing that others want to be happy and they don't yet have that happiness. They want to be free from suffering and they still have to suffer. But we have to see once more our own situation first through renunciation. And then that self-compassion simply gets generated for all beings. We think, I want to become a Buddha for their sake. I don't want to just be narrowly focused on my own welfare. I want to be intent upon helping all beings. So obviously, our grieving has a doorway to that, right? Because we can see that when we begin to expand outside of ourselves, oftentimes our grief will diminish in its importance. I want to share one little passage about that from we're ending at 3, yes? Is that correct? Okay, just want to make sure. This is a passage from a Buddhist Grief Observed in the chapter that's called Taking Care. And this is where Guy Newland talks about how what he found very refreshing in his own healing process was when he was able to be a benefit to others. He says, seeing others' pain and feeling that we just might be able to ease it in some way, often this is the best therapy for our wounds. And he talks about his wife, Valerie. Some of Valerie's last visitors came without even realizing it to get off the books therapy from the dying woman. And she helped them. And this actually helped her. So even in the midst of her dying, she was happy that people were coming to her seeking help and her having the ability to help them. And he says, I did feel put upon when, within a month of Valerie's death, people pressed me to give talks, to help with scholarly problems, and to assume leadership roles. But those who imposed upon me in this way, forbearing my negative mindset, gave me the chance to become helpful and were therefore great helpers. So again, I'm not saying this is license for us to go, asking help of people who are grieving, but it's to have that understanding that if we have some context of seeing that even when we are grieving, that there's an incredible opportunity to be a benefit to others. I found that was one of the most powerful things about being in the grief support group, that I went into after it was about an 8-week support group, which, again, not putting a time limit on anything, 8 weeks is enough time, I suppose, to get your head around some things, but it's not your whole process. But it was that you were there with other people that were also benefiting from what you shared. I was even in a group with other men who had partners with AIDS before Ed's passing, and that was incredibly beneficial because them sharing what they were going through and their feelings and being able to express their own anger and frustration and depression and whatever was going on, I was able to benefit from them and benefit them by what I had to share. So I think there's something about when we get out of ourselves, even in the midst of our grief, even as much as we need to grieve sometimes because it's the best thing for ourselves, to recognize that there's that dimension of being a benefit to others. Holding that bodhicitta motivation to whatever degree we can, trying to be compassionately concerned about others. Kind of gets us sort of out of our stuff to some degree. Not that we have to be permanently out of that. It helps us to see that there's still that other dimension to us, other aspect of our being that is so important on the Buddhist path. We are all in this together. And we talk about interdependence the other night in terms of the environment, but interdependence is everywhere with regard to everything. We all are dependent upon each other. Nobody lives as an island, completely separated and isolated from others. And that's actually the delusion that we're living with, that we address with the third principal aspect, is that thought that we're somehow in some independent status. Oh no, we're intimately involved with everybody. The welfare of everyone else is my own welfare. And the suffering of everyone else is my own suffering. Master Shantideva brings this up in his wonderful text, Guide to the Bodhisattva's Way of Life, where he says, suffering should be relieved because it's suffering, not because it's mine or anyone else's. It's suffering in and of itself is a problem. So why do we kind of narrowly just look at my suffering, my well-being, and don't think about the suffering of others? And the suffering of others affects us. Instead, we again are working from this sort of diluted place of self and what have you. One thing before we leave bodhicitta, though, is I do want to mention this practice of Tonglen. I won't have time to go into the full, instruction on it, but Tonglen is two Tibetan words actually. Tong means to give, and Len means to take. So Tonglen. We actually do it in reverse order. Usually we take and then we give. And of course, if we're like everybody else in the world, we take what we want and we give away what we don't want. Thank you. I'll take all that happiness and suffering, not for me. It's the exact opposite. This is a mind training technique, a Lojong technique, where we actually take the suffering of others on ourselves mentally. Doesn't mean that I have to go and transplant all their cancer cells into my body so I have cancer instead of them. It means mentally I think about taking on the suffering of another being, or other beings, plural, whatever it is you're working, and be willing to give away your happiness for the sake of others' welfare. It's a very powerful mind. Again, there are techniques for doing this. Pema Chodron has her own technique she talks about, but most Mahayana books, many of them, touch on this idea of Tonglen as a very powerful spiritual practice. But the idea is you think about somebody who's suffering. So when you're in your grief, when you're grieving very deeply, you can think about the fact that you're not alone in your grief. Many people on this very day, at this very hour, are grieving the loss of a relationship, a loved one, what have you. And think about them, and think about even just to have the thought, through my having to endure this pain of grief, may they be free of theirs. That's already a really powerful thought. And it's only for those people who you can, imagine that are in a similar state of grieving. That's already amazing. But if you can even think about suffering beyond that, and to think about being willing to take that on yourself. I know that when you're in a really difficult place with grieving and you're feeling a lot of pain, taking on more pain isn't necessarily what you want to hear. But if you're a Mahayana practitioner, then that means that we have to be willing to see that we want to always hold that view of my pain being a touchstone for others' pain, and the recognition that the most important mind for me to continue to work on is to have that compassionate wish to remove their pain. So Tonglen's all about being able to, in your mind, in your visualization, take that away, and in the process, remove that tendency that we have to be very, very self-centered. It can manifest in subtle ways when we simply just have renunciation and simply think that, oh, I'm just going to get the heck out of samsara myself. Good luck, everyone else. I hope you make it out too. Instead, we're going to be intent on continuing to use our own suffering to touch the suffering of others, to be aware of the suffering of others, and to recognize that most important for my own welfare as well as the welfare of others is that I become a Buddha for their sake. Because the fulfillment of my own potential to the greatest degree is when I do become a Buddha. It's not just becoming liberated, achieving nirvana. That's one goal, but it's a temporary goal. The final goal for all beings is to become fully enlightened. So that's the idea behind bodhicitta. So absolutely, our grief can be a doorway through which we can generate the compassionate wish to remove the suffering of others, the loving kindness that wants to give them all that we have so that they experience happiness. And I'll open it up to questions in a moment. Let me go forward and just do the final of these three, which is really kind of one of the most difficult topics in Buddhism, the correct view of emptiness. Many of you hear this word in Sanskrit, it's shunyata. Shunyata is the idea that things lack something. They lack a way of being. That's why we use the word emptiness or voidness sometimes. The idea is that we have to know what they lack. What are they empty of? Otherwise, it doesn't make any sense. Otherwise, you just say things are empty. Well, what does that mean? And you might even misinterpret it to think things don't exist at all. They're empty of mere existence. Well, that, we know that's not true because we're all sitting here, right? You're here, I'm here, everyone's here. Let's, acknowledge that things do exist. So what are they empty of? They're empty of essentially what I was kind of describing a little bit earlier, of things existing in an independent, separate, unrelated way, kind of establishing themselves. So if I talk about the I, the me, that every one of us is walking around with a sense of, right? Sense of I am here, I am in this room. We distort that sense of I to think that there's a real I that is in this independent mode, existing apart from other beings, existing apart from the world around us, existing as a standalone, self-sufficient entity. We have a lot of different distorted misconceptions, but they all boil down at their deepest level to this idea that the I exists from its own side, self-established, self-instituting. And if we look at how the I actually exists, and this is probably the most helpful way to get a view of emptiness, if we come to understand that the I actually exists in dependence upon things, not independently, then we gain an appreciation for how it can't possibly exist independently. So I'm just going to talk about the three ways that we assert that there is what we call dependent arising or dependent origination. First of all, everything that is produced, and I'm a product, I'm produced from various causes and conditions. I depend on those causes and conditions, right? If we talked about a book, well, we could say there are many causes and conditions to a book. We all know these from our physical world that we're aware of, that, the pulp of a tree gets, produced into, now it's maybe even recycled, paper, but all of it came from a tree originally and it gets made into these pages. And then you have the ink that comes from various causes and conditions. And of course, you have the person who wrote the book and the printing press that was involved and the person operating the printing press and whatever. I mean, you have so many different things involved. You have the glue that's inside the spine here. You have various things that are involved that are kind of causes and conditions that led to this book being here. And all the people involved in that process and all the things that allowed those people to be involved in that process. Is there a book that exists independent of those causes and conditions? Well, no, it depends upon them. You don't have the causes and conditions, you don't have the book. The same with the I. If I don't have all the causes and conditions that led to me sitting here right now, there'd be no I here right now. There's the causes and conditions of my body, which were initially the two cells of my parents that united in the womb of my mother, that then split and divided and eventually became the fetus in the womb, and eventually I came out of the womb and that little baby body and whatever and all this. There's a continuity of that body that was through various causes and conditions, and the food that I ate and all the various things and so on. There's the continuity of my mind that also has its own causes and conditions. Prior moments of mind that give rise to the next moment and the next moment and so on. And everything, all the various landscape of my mind and so on. All those causes and conditions, I depend upon them for my existence. Is there an I, a Don, that exists independent of those? No. Right? Pretty easy to see that. The second level is dependence upon parts. Well, what are the parts of a Don or an I? Well, usually we can talk about the mind and the body. There's the Don's mind and Don's body here in front of you. You can't see Don's mind because Don's mind isn't a material phenomenon. It's a stream of consciousness and awareness. It's continually arising from those prior moments. Is there a Don that exists independent of those parts? Again, we can say the mind has many, many more parts and the body has many, many more parts. And maybe we could take away a part of the body, because some people do lose a part of their body. I have all my parts intact, I hope. but some people come back from war and they are missing limbs and what have you. We still say they have a body and that they're still there. But nonetheless, if you completely remove the body, and the mind that is left there, is that Don? Does the Don still exist on the basis of just a mind being there? Well, Don is a being who is encapsulated from when Don was conceived to when Don dies. So no, when the body ceases to exist, then Don no longer exists. So essentially we have this phenomenon that is the whole, that is Don, or the I, that is involved in the parts. dependent upon the parts. The parts of Don are the mind and the body. So if I remove the mind and the body, do I have Don sort of remaining? No, Don is dependent upon parts, the parts of Don. And it's like this for all things. If I talk about the book, it has many parts too, right? The book has the front cover and the back cover and the spine and the various pages and the individual words on the pages and so on. I mean, all the various things that make up a book. The book depends upon its parts. If you don't have the parts, you don't have the book. Right? And that one we can get even a little harder, but still pretty easy. The third level of dependent arising is that I depend upon the conceptual mind labeling or designating this as I. This is a little bit harder to get, but we have to see that in essence, all that is happening in terms of establishing things as existing is that we are conceptually coming up with a label, an idea, a concept that we are putting on this collection of stuff. So let's go back to the book. It might be easier to see it with that first. This stuff that's in my hand, we now are going to consider not just parts of a book, we're going to consider it the basis of labeling or the basis of designating a book. It just has that characteristic of being a basis. And then we put the label book on this. There's no book that is real from the side of this collection of stuff. I don't have a real book in my hand. Book is an idea that we give, a concept we give to designating this collection of stuff. And we all conventionally agree to that, right? We're going to agree to call this a book, and we'll call this a computer, and we'll call this a piece of paper. And, whatever we designate certain things as on the basis of our own agreement as to what role they play, what function they serve, and so on. It's not just language, though language is a key part of it for all of us communicating with each other, because even pre-lingual, you will have some conceptual idea of your world and structuring your world to relate to it. Even a baby, an infant who is wanting mother's milk knows that it's going to cry for this thing that it's identifying as the substance it wants and craves and desires for its own, nurturing and health. It's not going to say, "Hey, Ma, where's the mother's milk?" It's not going to use language at that age, but it's going to have a concept that it relates to that thing, gives a label, a conceptual label to that. In the end, that's how everything exists. Whether we talk about a book or an eye or a computer, there's no real object from the side of this basis. This is just the basis for me to designate it as book. Where it becomes particularly relevant is with regard to the I, because I think there's a real I here. And on the basis of that real I engage in all sorts of crazy behavior, trying to defend that I and protect that I and get that I what it wants. And I'm ending up feeding this whole circle of a complete illusion, something that doesn't exist at all. You do exist, but how do you exist as a dependent arising? Independence upon the causes and conditions, independence upon the parts, and in the subtlest way, independence upon thinking this is I. And that's enough for the I to exist. It doesn't need more than that to exist. Everything else is an embellishment, a superimposition that needs to be removed. It's not correct. So we've had this ignorance that thinks that things are here in that real way. I use real because Lama Zopa uses this term. By that, I don't mean that we're denying reality in total, but the reality that we are buying into, this sense of the things being real, is not real at all. It does not exist at all. We do not exist in some concrete, independent, self-established way. We are simply imputed in dependence upon a basis. You have to have the basis there. I can't say Don's out in the hallway right now because Don's aggregates, or I should use that term aggregates, I didn't use it earlier. Don's body and mind aren't out in the hallway. Right? You need to have the basis for us to designate something. You can't say, is there a book on the table when, these aren't on the table? You go, okay, there's no book on the table. Now, when I put the basis for a book on the table, I can say there's a book on the table. It has to be a basis, but that basis doesn't have any identification from its own side as being what we are designating it as. In an example, I like to use this example, sometimes I got it from another teacher, is that if I had like a wooden stick or a dowel or something, I don't know, let's just use maybe this part of this. Okay, so imagine there's no metal bell. And I just had this wooden dowel here, and there was a dog in the room. And I threw it across the room, and the dog went running over there and started chewing on it, right? As dogs are prone to do, especially big dogs. They really like to chew on stuff, right? Would that we might have the perspective, oh, Don, that dog is chewing on the handle of the bell. But does the dog know it is handle of the bell? There's no concept of it as being a bell handle, right? I think it totally is consumed with it being their own internal image of a chew toy, whatever they're referring to that as. Might even have the words for it. They'd have a concept of this is something good I can chew on. So is there really a chew toy from the side of this, or a bell handle from the side of this, or nothing from the side of it? There's nothing from the side of this according to the Buddha. Instead, it's dependent upon the beings who are relating to it. Now, there is a physical thing here. I can pop it with my finger there, right? But it has no identity from its own side. Just like they can say, I'm in the room right now, but I'm not an I existing from my own side, independently, on my own. Well, that's a long way. Maybe I didn't even do justice to explaining emptiness. It's a long way to get to the point that eventually, when Guy Newland was asked whether the teachings on emptiness helped him in his grief, he said, absolutely not. I found it kind of interesting. I had to explain it because, I mean, I'm going to, he talks about it in the book. It's in the chapter here called The Great Matter. And he says, who dies is the name of this chapter, or this part of the chapter. He says, in the Buddhist tradition, we say that in the flow of change, there is never any fixed thing we can point out that corresponds to the things named by our language or by our concepts. It's useful to think of things and people as though they had fixed identities, but they don't, right? The book doesn't have a fixed identity. I don't have a fixed identity. They are like fast rushing streams, and a table is just what we call a certain collection of table parts, none of which is itself a table. That's the whole analysis you can do on the other side to see that you can't find the real Don to be equivalent to just the mind or the body or any part of the mind or the body. You can't find the book to be equivalent to just some part of the book, or even the collection of parts. Because a collection of parts means multiple things. How can a unitary thing such as a book be a collection of stuff? We don't find anything to be real from its own side. He says everything and person is what it is only in relation to a perspective, a point of view. Nothing exists as this or that from its own side, as a bell ringer, bell handle, or a chew toy or whatever. Nothing from the side of the object. Nothing exists in that way. So everything and everyone and everything is empty of existing in the way we usually see them. That's what we mean by emptiness. So he went on to talk about all of this, about emptiness and so on. And he says, so it is that when someone asked me in the early months whether my familiarity with Buddhist teachings on emptiness had consoled me in my grief, my reflexive answer was just no. All I could think was that Valerie, empty or not, was definitely around here before, and now she is definitely not. And that hurts. So I don't think that the emptiness teachings are necessary or your go-to teaching, even if you've been around Buddhism for a while, to contend with your grief. Deal with the experience of your loss, the hurt, the pain. Use it in ways maybe to open up to the suffering of others, to see your own suffering very clearly, as we already talked about. And maybe further down the road, down the pike, you might be able to actually say, well, who dies and who's grieving, and maybe do that a deeper investigation into the I and into all the phenomena that exist. I brought it up because Guy Newland did as well, and I think it's worthwhile kind of introducing that teaching at least as something too that perhaps again we might be able to get our heads around at a later point, but in our grief might not be quite as relevant. Now, somebody who's got a deeper understanding of emptiness might have a very different grieving process, right? Because they aren't thinking of themselves as being this solid, independent self and the other person being that way as well. And so there's maybe much more fluidity to what they're experiencing. There's a spaciousness around it. That's where kind of emptiness does kind of evoke that sort of kind of openness and spaciousness. That's what we should feel when we realize emptiness, is we're not constricted to this strong sense of everything being tightly put into its own little, compartment as what it is. We start seeing the interconnectedness of things, the spaciousness that's around all of that.
Infinite nature.
Yeah, absolutely. So again, I don't think that the emptiness teachings are necessarily the go-to teaching, but I think there is a dimension to them that we could apply given the right amount of training, in advance. Any questions or comments on that? I know I've just opened up emptiness at the tail end here, but yes, Gracia.
Yeah, I'm just thinking that I used to think for in terms of people had fixed,
Mhm.
fixed the problems, fixed the whatever, and to have this way of looking at life and people is really wonderful and freeing, and so no one is really truly bad forever.
Right.
It's just a temporary moment, and depending on, and so it's kind of included.
Good. I think it can be really, and even just at that level of causes and conditions, that we understand that people, how they are in this world, they're a product of the causes and conditions that led them to be that way. They're not fixed, they're not some static being, and other causes and conditions could come into play that change them in ways. And I've heard many stories, and we all have probably, of people who've had sort of complete turnarounds in their life where they were kind of moving in one trajectory in a very, what looked like a very fixed way of being, and then something happened and they transformed and changed into something completely different. We're all works in progress. So if we see emptiness applies at that level too, it says it's only through the force of emptiness that things aren't in that sort of permanent, unchanging, fixed way, that things can exist, that we can become a Buddha. I talked earlier about Buddha nature having two dimensions, and I focused on the one that's kind of our mind developing that into that. The other one is the emptiness of our minds, because it's through the emptiness of our minds that we can have that transformation. If everything was inherently and sort of intrinsically and independently existing, then we would never be able to change. So it's weird. We kind of change through the process of realizing our fundamental potential for change, our emptiness. Emptiness has always been there. It's just we've never realized it. We've never been more than merely imputed beings and, empty of any inherent existence, any intrinsic existence. Anyway, the emptiness teachings are vast and they're huge. And I really encourage you to receive teachings from more qualified people than myself as well. His Holiness Lama Zopa Rinpoche, all these amazing teachers who have realized emptiness. I have some intellectual understanding of what they say about emptiness, but not necessarily conveying everything about it because I don't have that perfect wisdom. So I want to share just a few things as closing comments. We just open it up for more, another Q&A type of thing if possible, if we have the time. My concluding thoughts are just twofold and from two different people. One is from Guy Newland, and I like this: to be human is to set sail for the next shipwreck. So don't forget, this is the nature of our existence, that we're all just kind of waiting for the next thing to happen. And that's part of our human situation, just that might sound a little pessimistic. So I'm adding a saying from Lao Tzu. Many of you know Lao Tzu, who wrote the I Ching. Not the I Ching. It's the Tao Te Ching. Sorry. New beginnings are often disguised as painful endings. So we can often see that even though there's painful endings, even though there's these, moments of grief, even though there's a shipwreck right around the corner, there's often new beginnings that come with that. And to hold that sort of perspective. I remember Venerable Robina, when she was teaching once, she said, even if you're drowning, there's no reason why you shouldn't be optimistic. And it's kind of true. To keep sort of a positive spin on things, a positive perspective that, once more, everything's an opportunity. As painful as grief is, as difficult as what many of the shipwrecks of life are, we still have that opportunity within them. So I hope this has been of some benefit and given you some thought for some things to think about in regard to grief, but also how we can learn from all aspects of our life, but to especially embrace the experience of grief that all of you have had, as well as the griefs you'll experience in the future. So any final questions or comments from anyone else? Anyone online?
I'll share something.
Yeah, please, Rob.
Stepfather passed away 8 or so years ago. My mother and I are sitting by his gravesite spring afternoon, and he's very, very sad. Same she is. And so as a result of Tendrin's teachings and what I've been learning, he mentioned it twice today, once at lunch and just recently, the idea of transformation and a continuation. And this now is like prove everything. It's like it's opening everything Buddha says now is becoming evidence, right? In science. So in quantum physics, we learned that, right? Energy can be transformed, excuse me, to matter, and matter can be transformed to energy. Energy can be transformed into energy and matter to matter, but neither can be destroyed. There may be some entropy in there, but neither can be destroyed. So that is still there with you in some form or energy that you just cannot perceive right now. And you just see the relief on her face, which is really interesting. And it helps me too sometimes to really fathom what it means to be in this incarnation, to be this human being, what the future might hold, because like most of us, I live in fear constantly, right? What may occur, may not occur. And so knowing or learning more about teachings and about our existence and the those beginnings and continuation is very, very helpful.
Yeah. Yeah, we were talking about that at lunch too with Thich Nhat Hanh, kind of saying, you know, he still, his students still think of him as living on, because in a sense he does, you know, in a sense there's no end to any of it. And we can use that phrase, there is no death, but it's not meant to be like completely saying we don't have this phenomenon that we call death. I mean, in the end, there's nothing does really die. Pardon?
I didn't know he was gone.
Yeah, he passed away. Was it earlier this year?
I think it was in April, yeah.
April.
I think April.
Yeah. Yeah. So. All right. Can end with some nice thoughts on that. So let's just hold this awareness of kind of what we've done here and do some dedication and just really look back at this whole day, these 4 hours that we spent together looking at this topic, and with some tenderness for our own grief, the micro griefs, all the different griefs that we experience, as well as a tenderness towards all beings who are just like us, experiencing loss, having to go from one thing to another, and often doing it with such confusion and such pain. We want to generate the thought that everything we've done will be a benefit to them as well as ourselves, our own attainment of Buddhahood, enlightenment, so we then can help others on their spiritual path, help them to awaken fully. We dedicate very strongly for that. We also dedicate for the good health and long lives of all of our precious teachers, especially His Holiness the Dalai Lama, Lama Zopa Rinpoche, all the other teachers that we and others have a karmic connection with. And I always like to include, you know, any being who is dedicated to guiding others spiritually, whatever their tradition. They are helping others to find a path, to find meaning in their life, to engage in compassion and kindness and all the other qualities that spiritual paths teach. All these spiritual guides are so precious. Let's pray very deeply for their good health and long lives, and that we and others may always have perfect guides in our lives. And then lastly, I'd like to make things very personal for us, dedicating in our own heart for those beings that we hold very close and dear right now, who might be going through difficulties, or even parts of the world where perhaps we have a strong motivation to want to benefit. We think about those who are engaged in having illness, having obstacles, who are dying or who have died, all the various forms of suffering. We think about them right now, those that are close to us, that we're holding in our heart, and send this positive energy out to them, kind of in a form of Tonglen. We say, all this positive energy that we've generated, may you benefit from it. May you be free from your suffering. May you find all the perfect causes that lead to true happiness. And then we end with making that strong motivation that all beings find true peace and happiness and complete freedom from suffering. Wonderful. I just might mention to people, if you can come to tomorrow morning's meditation, or that isn't Zoomed, right? Correct?
No, it's not.
I'll be leading